The roar of the thunder outside was less painful than the fading sound of that black Ford's engine disappearing into the curtain of rain. Frank and Mary stood there, ankle-deep in water, watching their only son choose to save his pet dog over his own flesh and blood. In that cruel moment, Jacob thought he had merely left a burden behind, but he was dead wrong. Without knowing it, he had just signed away his own inheritance. A trap born of tough love had been set for 5 years, waiting for the exact moment his heart turned to stone to snap shut. Could belated regret save a bond that was already shattered? Before we find out the answer, please leave a comment below telling us which city or country you are watching from. Because some stories, no matter how painful, need to be told. The rain hammered against the metal roof like desperate fists when Frank saw his son drive away for the last time in that black Ford Expedition, taking the dog he had raised himself since it was a puppy, without looking back even once. He left them there, him and his wife Mary, in that humble house in the town of Willow Creek, Missouri, in the middle of the most violent storm that had hit the region in 30 years. Water began to seep through the cracks in the windows, the wooden siding walls trembled with every clap of thunder, and as Frank held Mary in his arms, both soaked and shivering from the cold, he knew that his only son had abandoned them exactly when they needed him most, as if they were unwanted debris from a life he no longer wanted to remember. But what Frank didn't know, what neither of the two elderly people could imagine as they watched the taillights of that SUV fade into the curtain of water, was that in just a few weeks, the whole truth would come to light like a lightning bolt. When the law firm in Street, Louis read aloud the last will and testament of Arthur Frank's father, it would illuminate what had always been hidden under layers of lies, resentment, and ambition. Because the inheritance everyone thought was lost, the fortune that supposedly had vanished with time, existed. It was intact, and it came accompanied by a moral clause that would turn that afternoon of abandonment into the most damning testimony of a man's true nature. Before continuing with this story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and leave a like so more people can hear stories that touch the soul. Also, tell us in the comments what city and state you are watching this video from. Your message brings us closer than you imagine. That afternoon of August 15th, the sky over Willow Creek had turned the color of molten lead since 3 p.m. Frank, 74 years old, his body hunched from decades of work in the cornfields and hands tanned like old leather, had looked up with that farmer's wisdom that reads the weather in the shapes of the clouds. He knew those signs well. The unnatural stillness of the air, the silence of the birds, the smell of wet earth that arrived before the first drop. He had told Mary, his partner of 50 years, to get ready because something big was coming, something they hadn't seen in a long time. Mary, 72 years old, with her hair completely white, tied back in a tight bun, and her eyes still bright despite the exhaustion life had left in every wrinkle of her face, had begun to close the storm shutters, to bring the hanging baskets in from the porch, to check for new leaks in the roof. Her movements were slow but precise, every gesture loaded with the experience of someone who has lived an entire existence in that house, who knows every corner, every loose board, every crack in the drywall. The house was small, just 3 bedrooms, with linoleum floors they had laid themselves 30 years ago, walls with vinyl siding that kept the cool in summer and the heat in winter, and a backyard where some tomato plants still grew, and an old oak tree that had seen the birth of their son and grandchildren. Frank's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, where a dusty envelope lay unopened. It was from 2 Christmases ago. Inside was a check for $500 and a pre-printed card signed by Jacob's secretary, not even by his own hand. Frank remembered that winter well. Mary had been bedridden with the flu, delirious with fever, calling out for her son. Frank had called Jacob, begging him to come, just to sit by her side for an hour. Jacob had replied that he was in the middle of a merger and sent the check instead, as if $500 could cool a mother's fever or hold her hand while she slept. That check had never been cashed. It sat there as a silent monument to the transaction their relationship had become. Jacob bought his guilt, and they paid with their loneliness. It was then that the call came. The old telephone, one of those that still hung on the wall with a cord, rang with its metallic and shrill ring. Frank picked it up with trembling hands, always with that mix of hope and fear he felt every time he heard his son's voice on the other end of the line. Jacob almost never called, barely once a month, if that, and always brief, sharp conversations, full of awkward silences and hurried excuses to hang up soon. "Dad," Jacob had said, with that educated professional voice he had cultivated during his years at the university and now used in the courts of St. Louis, where he practiced as a successful attorney. "I'm heading down there with Ashley and the kids. We'll be there around 5. We want to spend the weekend with you." Frank had felt his heart expand in his chest like a balloon full of joy. It had been almost a year since he had seen his son, and even longer for his grandchildren, twins, 12 years old, Hunter and Savannah, who barely remembered what that dusty town was like, that humble house where their father had grown up barefoot and happy. He had given the news to Mary, and she, despite her natural skepticism towards Jacob's promises, had smiled and started preparing everything. She had taken out the clean sheets, put the pot roast in the slow cooker, started making cornbread from scratch, that buttery cornbread that Jacob loved so much when he was a boy. But while Mary worked in the kitchen, Frank had felt something strange in his stomach, an uneasiness he couldn't explain. He knew his son, knew that tone of voice, that way of speaking that sounded too formal, too distant. Jacob never said, "We want to spend the weekend with you," like that, in such a planned way. Normally when he visited, he announced it with reluctance, as if fulfilling a duty, not sharing a genuine desire. But Frank had drowned out those doubts. He had told himself he was being paranoid, that he should give his son the benefit of the doubt, that maybe finally Jacob had remembered where he came from and wanted to reconnect with his roots. They arrived exactly at 5:15, just when the first drops began to fall. The black SUV, a brand new Ford Expedition, shiny and enormous, parked in front of the humble farmhouse, creating a contrast so violent that some neighbors peeked out their windows to see. Out stepped Jacob, tall, nearly 6 feet, dressed in casual clothes, but clearly expensive. Khaki pants, a branded white shirt, loafers that would get muddy in seconds. He was 45 years old, but looked younger. Hair perfectly cut, beard trimmed with millimetric precision, hands soft and manicured of someone who has never worked under the sun. Behind him stepped Ashley, his wife, a 40-year-old woman who came from a wealthy family in St. Louis, thin to the point of fragility, with large sunglasses she didn't take off even when entering the house, dressed completely in white, as if she were going to an art gallery and not to visit her in-laws in a dusty town. And then the twins, Hunter and Savannah, both glued to their cell phones, with wireless headphones in their ears, dressed in branded sportswear that cost more than Frank and Mary's entire monthly grocery budget. And with them, jumping from the back of the SUV, came Thor, the dog Frank had raised since he was a puppy of barely 3 weeks, a beautiful German shepherd with gold and black fur, intelligent and loyal eyes, who had been Frank's constant companion for the last 3 years. Frank had raised Thor with his own hands. He had spent sleepless nights when the puppy was sick. He had fed him warm milk from a bottle. He had taught him to sit, to shake, to guard the house. Thor was more than a pet to him. He was the son Jacob had ceased to be, the unconditional company in the long and lonely afternoons. Jacob had taken Thor 6 months ago with the excuse that in the town he didn't have the necessary care, that he could take him to the vet regularly, give him better food, more space in the garden of his house in St. Louis. Frank had accepted with a broken heart, because deep down he knew it was true, that Thor deserved a better life than he could offer. But what hurt him most wasn't the absence of the dog, but the way Jacob had turned him into a symbol of his own success, a luxury pet he showed off on social media instead of the humble companion he had been in that farmhouse. "Dad." "Mom?" Jacob had said upon entering, hugging them briefly, almost without really touching them, the way one hugs distant acquaintances at a social gathering. Ashley had greeted them with a wave, without getting too close, and the twins had barely looked up from their screens to murmur an inaudible, "Hi." Thor, on the other hand, had run straight to Frank. He had jumped on him with that desperate joy of dogs, who recognized who really loved them. He had licked his wrinkled face while the old man knelt on the linoleum, hugging him with tears in his eyes that he tried to hide, rubbing his face with the excuse of the dust. The first few minutes had been awkward, full of forced silences and superficial conversations. Ashley had walked through the house with a look that didn't hide her disgust, barely touching things as if she were afraid of catching poverty. The twins had stayed in the living room, sitting on the old plaid sofa, without taking off their headphones, submerged in their digital worlds. Jacob had accepted the coffee Mary offered, but had drunk it quickly, without savoring it, without making that gesture of satisfaction he used to make when he was a boy and drank his mother's coffee. Mary had brought the fresh cornbread, still hot, with melted butter, those simple delights that had fed Jacob throughout his childhood. She had put them on the table with pride, hoping to see in her son's eyes that spark of nostalgia, that recognition of everything she had done for him. But Jacob had barely tasted it. He had mumbled something about being on a diet, about watching his health, about gluten disagreeing with him. Ashley hadn't even touched them, and the twins had wrinkled their noses with displeasure when Mary offered. It was then that the storm worsened. The sky opened up suddenly, and the rain began to fall, with a violence that made the walls shake. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, making the metal roof sound like war drums. In a matter of minutes, the streets of the town turned into rivers of mud. Water began to accumulate in the yard, and one of the kitchen windows blew open, letting in a curtain of water that soaked the floor. Frank had gotten up immediately, moving with a speed that contradicted his age when there was an emergency. He had run to the window to close it, but the frame was swollen from the humidity and wouldn't budge. Mary had come to help him, both pushing together, fighting against the wind that seemed to have a will of its own. The water kept coming in, soaking them, filling the kitchen with puddles that expanded into the other rooms. "Jacob," Frank had shouted over the roar of the storm. "Help us, son!" But when he turned, Jacob was standing in the middle of the living room with his cell phone in hand, looking at the screen with a frown. He hadn't moved, hadn't made any attempt to help. Ashley was next to him, also with her phone, murmuring something about the internet signal, about not being able to post anything on social media. The twins were still on the sofa, oblivious to everything, lost in their screens. "Jacob, please," Mary had pleaded, her voice breaking as she continued pushing the window along with her husband. Finally, Jacob had put away the phone and walked towards them, not running, not with urgency, but with those measured and professional steps he used in the courtroom. He had helped close the window with a strength that evidenced how easy it would have been if he had done it from the beginning. Then he had dusted off his hands as if cleaning himself of something unpleasant and had returned to the living room without saying a word. The electric light flickered 1, 2, 3 times and then went out completely. The house was plunged into a gray gloom, illuminated barely by the lightning that exploded in the sky like white light bombs. Mary had lit the candles, those emergency candles she kept in a drawer, and their trembling light had created dancing shadows on the walls. "We can't stay here," Ashley had said suddenly, her high-pitched voice cutting the silence. "This is dangerous. The house could fall down. The house is over 50 years old," Frank had replied with dignity, still soaked, water dripping from his white hair. "It has withstood storms worse than this. It's built of solid oak timber, by my father's hands and mine. It's not going to fall." "Well, I'm not planning to risk my children," Ashley had replied, turning to Jacob. "We're leaving now." And it was in that moment that Frank saw something in his son's eyes that froze his blood more than the cold water running down his clothes. He saw calculation, he saw coldness, he saw the look of someone who had already made a decision before arriving, someone who had come not for love or nostalgia, but for some other motive that Frank couldn't grasp yet. "You're right," Jacob had said, and in his voice there was no doubt or conflict. "This is too dangerous. We're leaving." "We're leaving?" Frank had repeated, feeling something break inside his chest. "Son, what about us?" Jacob had looked at his father as if he had just remembered his existence. His eyes, those eyes that had once looked at Frank with adoration when he was a small boy climbing on his legs asking to be carried. Now they looked at him with a distance that hurt more than any physical blow. "You guys know the house?" Jacob had said, his voice neutral, professional, as if explaining something obvious to a not very intelligent client. "You know where to take shelter if something happens. We don't. It's better if we go back to Street Lewis, where we'll be safe." "But son," Mary had intervened, her voice trembling not just from the cold, but from something much deeper. "The highway must be flooded. It's dangerous to drive in this rain. Stay here with us. Together we'll be fine. Mom, the truck is 4-wheel drive." Jacob had replied with impatience, already gathering his children's backpacks. "It can handle any road, and I have to go back." Tomorrow morning I have an important hearing. I can't get stranded here. It is truly heartbreaking to watch a son treat his childhood home like a trap he must escape at all costs, prioritizing a court hearing over the safety of the people who gave him life. Jacob thinks he is making a smart, professional decision, but he fails to see the devastation he is leaving behind in his parents' eyes. Stay with us, because this cold calculation is the exact moment his fate gets sealed, and he won't even realize it until it's too late. Here, as if here were a despicable place, a site to escape from at all costs, as if this house where he had been born, where he had taken his first steps, where he had celebrated every birthday until he went to college, was a prison he had managed to leave and couldn't afford to return to, even for a stormy night. Ashley had already taken the twins by the hands, literally yanking them off the sofa, dragging them towards the door. They protested, not because they wanted to stay with their grandparents, but because they didn't want to interrupt their online games, because the signal was bad and they were losing their matches. "Jacob," Frank had said, and in his voice there was a plea he had never allowed himself before. "Don't leave us alone." But his son was already at the door with the keys to the expedition in his hand. The rain came in through the open door. The wind blew the curtains. The roar of the storm filled the whole house, and then, like a final stab, Jacob had whistled, a short, sharp, authoritarian whistle. Thor, who had been lying next to Frank, his head resting on the old man's feet, as he had done so many nights, had gotten up immediately. His ears had perked up. His tail had moved with uncertainty. He had looked at Frank, then at Jacob, then back at Frank. In those dog eyes there was a confusion that broke the soul, a loyalty divided between the man who had raised him and the man who now claimed him. "Thor, come," Jacob had ordered. "Thor, stay," Frank had murmured, but his voice had come out so weak, so broken, that the dog had barely heard it. Jacob had whistled again, this time with more authority, and Thor had begun to walk towards him. Every step of the dog had been like a nail in Frank's heart. Thor had stopped halfway, had turned one last time towards the old man, and in that moment Frank had seen in the animal's eyes something that destroyed him, an apology. The dog was asking for forgiveness for leaving, for obeying the call of the one who fed him expensive kibble instead of the one who had loved him with cornbread and scraps of stew. "He's my dog, Dad," Jacob had said. And in his voice there was a new hardness, an affirmation of property that turned Thor into an object, into a possession, instead of the living being who had been companion and family. "I bought him. I pay his expenses. I'm taking him." And with that he had gone out into the storm, with Thor running after him, jumping into the back of the SUV. Ashley and the twins were already inside, the doors closing, the engine roaring. Mary had run to the door, getting soaked instantly, shouting something that was lost in the howl of the wind. Frank had reached the threshold, his old legs refusing to take him further, watching as the truck pulled away, how its taillights disappeared into the curtain of water, how his son drove away without looking back even once. They closed the door finally, the heavy wood slamming shut like the lid of a coffin on their past lives. Inside the darkening house, the silence was louder than the thunder. It wasn't just quiet, it was the suffocating silence of a tomb. Frank looked at the empty spot on the rug where Thor used to sleep, and he felt a phantom pain, like a limb had been severed from his body. He looked at Mary, and for the first time in 50 years, he saw her not as his strong partner, but as a fragile, broken bird. They didn't speak. What words were left? To speak would be to make the abandonment real, and neither of them was ready to admit that the boy they had bathed, fed, and worshipped had looked at them and seen nothing but obstacles. And while the water kept rising, while the wind made the metal roof groan, threatening to tear it off, while thunder exploded over their heads like the wrath of a forgotten god, Frank had thought of everything he had sacrificed for that son who had just abandoned them. He thought of the early mornings working in the fields to pay for his education, of the meals he and Mary had skipped so Jacob could have new books, of the land they had sold to pay for the university and street. Louis, of the years Jacob hadn't returned even for Christmas, of the increasingly spaced-out calls, of the grandchildren who didn't know their grandparents, of the distance that had opened between them, like an abyss no bridge could cross. He had thought, too, of his own father, Arthur, the man who had built a small empire with his own hands and who had died 5 years ago, taking with him secrets no one had imagined. Arthur, whom everyone in the town remembered as a severe but fair man, hard-working until the last day of his life, who had managed businesses he almost never spoke of, who had traveled to the city of Street Louis every month for years, without explaining exactly what he did there. When Arthur died, everyone expected to find some inheritance, some will that revealed what had become of his businesses, his properties, his life savings, but the only thing that had appeared was a small bank account with barely enough money to pay for the funeral and some outstanding debts. Jacob, already an established lawyer by then, had reviewed all the legal documents, had searched in every file, in every old paper, and had declared with professional authority that there was nothing else, that the old man had died poor, that any fortune he might have had vanished with time. Frank had never completely believed that version. He knew his father, knew that shrewd look he had when keeping a secret, that barely perceptible smile when someone underestimated his intelligence, but he hadn't had the legal knowledge or the resources to investigate more, and eventually had accepted the word of his son, the lawyer, the professional, the one who knew about these things. Now, standing in the doorway of his house, while the storm tried to tear away everything he had, including his dignity, Frank wondered if there was something more to his father's story, something Jacob perhaps knew and had never said, but he shook his head, rejecting those thoughts. It couldn't be. His son might have abandoned them in the middle of a storm. He might have taken the dog he had raised. He might have become a stranger who barely tolerated visiting the place he came from, but stealing his own family's inheritance, lying about his grandfather's last will, that would be unforgivable. That would be something not even Jacob could do. Or so he thought. The doubt had planted itself in his heart like a poisonous seed. And while Mary cried silently against his soaked chest, while the water kept rising and the night became darker, Frank felt something inside him change. For the first time in his life, looking towards where his son had disappeared, he didn't feel unconditional love. He felt rage. He felt betrayal. And he felt, deeper than all that, a determination he didn't know he still possessed. If there was anything to discover about Arthur's inheritance, if there was any hidden truth in the papers Jacob had reviewed 5 years ago, Frank would find it. Not for the money, because at 74, he no longer needed riches, but for justice, for the truth, to understand exactly what kind of man his son had become. The storm roared louder, as if nature itself had heard his silent oath. And somewhere in the city of Street Louis, in a law office that remained closed until certain specific requirements of Arthur's will were met, a sealed envelope awaited its moment, keeping secrets that would change everything, that would expose truths some had tried to bury, that would reveal not only who Arthur really was, but also who his grandson was, the successful lawyer who had just abandoned his parents in the middle of the most violent storm in 30 years. But that night, Frank and Mary knew nothing of that. They only knew they were alone, soaked, with water rising around their feet, in a house that threatened to crumble, abandoned by the only son they had, betrayed by the dog they had raised as family. They only knew life had dealt them another blow, perhaps the hardest of all, and that they would have to survive it, as they had survived everything else, together, clinging to each other, with the dignity no one could take from them, even if they took everything else. They closed the door finally, the heavy wood slamming shut like the lid of a coffin on their past lives. Inside the darkening house, the silence was louder than the thunder. It wasn't just quiet. It was the suffocating silence of a tomb. Frank looked at the empty spot on the rug where Thor used to sleep, and he felt a phantom pain, like a limb had been severed from his body. He looked at Mary, and for the first time in 50 years, he saw her not as his strong partner, but as a fragile, broken bird. They didn't speak. What words were left? To speak would be to make the abandonment real, and neither of them was ready to admit that the boy they had bathed, fed, and worshipped had looked at them and seen nothing but obstacles. It wasn't just the storm outside. A storm of humiliation raged inside Frank's chest. He felt a physical pain in his gut, a hollowness where his pride used to be. For decades, he had excused Jacob's coldness, rationalized his absence, and swallowed his own dignity to keep the peace. But as he looked at Mary, shivering and sobbing in the flickering candlelight, something inside Frank snapped. The unconditional love of a father didn't die, but it curdled into a cold, hard resolve. He dragged old towels to stop the water, his movements no longer frantic but methodical, fueled by a new, icy anger. They sat on the bed where they had conceived Jacob, but Frank no longer saw the little boy he had raised. He saw a monster, and for the first time in his life, Frank didn't want reconciliation. He wanted justice. And while the storm kept unloading its fury over Willow Creek, while the walls shook and the roof creaked, and water sought every crack to enter, Frank, a humble farmer with weathered hands and a now broken heart, took Mary's wrinkled hand in his and made her a promise she heard barely above the roar of the storm. The cold from the damp floor seeped into their bones, awakening the arthritis that gnawed at their joints. Every shiver was a reminder of their age, of their helplessness. Frank tried to rub warmth into Mary's hands, but his own were shaking uncontrollably. He questioned himself in the darkness. A torture worse than the storm. Did I love him too much? He thought. Did we shield him from the hardness of life so well that he forgot how to care for those who suffer? The guilt of a parent is a heavy stone, and that night, it crushed Frank's chest harder than the fear of the rising water. He felt like a gardener who had watered a plant with his own blood, only to watch it grow thorns that poisoned him. We're going to find out the truth, old girl. About my father, about the inheritance, about what really happened. And when we know, Jacob is going to have to look us in the eyes and explain why he left us here tonight, why he chose an expensive truck and a dog over his own parents. Mary didn't answer with words, just squeezed his hand tighter, and in that squeeze there was an agreement, a complicity of 50 years that didn't need to be verbalized. Later that night, while Frank stared at the ceiling, Mary went to the kitchen. The pot roast was still in the slow cooker, now cold and congealed. The cornbread she had baked with such pride sat untouched on the counter, covered in a cloth like a shroud. She picked up the pan to throw it away, but her hands froze. Throwing away the food meant admitting that no one wanted to eat it. It meant admitting that her love, manifested in flour and butter, had been rejected. She scraped the meal into the bin, and with every scrape, she felt like she was hollowing out her own heart. A mother's love is designed to feed, to nurture. When that love is refused, it doesn't just disappear. It turns into a heavy, sour lump in the throat that cannot be swallowed. Together they had survived poverty, droughts, illnesses, the loss of 3 babies before Jacob was born, and survived. Together they would survive this too, and together they would discover if their son was just ungrateful or if he was something much worse. Later that night, while Frank stared at the ceiling, Mary went to the kitchen. The pot roast was still in the slow cooker, now cold and congealed. The cornbread she had baked with such pride sat untouched on the counter, covered in a cloth like a shroud. She picked up the pan to throw it away, but her hands froze. Throwing away the food meant admitting that no one wanted to eat it. It meant admitting that her love, manifested in flour and butter, had been rejected. She scraped the meal into the bin, and with every scrape, she felt like she was hollowing out her own heart. A mother's love is designed to feed, to nurture. When that love is refused, it doesn't just disappear. It turns into a heavy, sour lump in the throat that cannot be swallowed. The storm lasted all night, and when it finally dawned, Willow Creek looked like a ghost town covered in mud and debris. The sun came out shyly between gray clouds that still threatened more rain, illuminating a landscape transformed by the violence of the water. The streets were rivers of brown mud. Trees had lost entire branches that now blocked the roads, and several houses in the lower parts of the town had suffered severe damage. Frank and Mary's house had resisted just as he had promised, although the leaks had left dark stains on the walls and a permanent puddle in the kitchen that would take days to dry completely. Frank had gotten up with the first ray of light, despite having barely slept 2 hours. His body hurt in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was a pain that came from inside, from a place where bones and muscles couldn't reach. He had put on the same damp clothes from the day before, because he hadn't had the energy to change, and had gone out to the yard to assess the damage. The apple tree was miraculously still standing, although it had lost several thick branches. The tomato plants were down, crushed by the weight of the water. The chicken coop they had built years ago was completely destroyed. The 3 chickens they had were gone, probably swept away by the current or taken by some hungry animal during the confusion of the storm. Mary had come out behind him, wrapped in an old shawl, her white hair still wet and stuck to her skull. They said nothing for a long time, just walked together through the devastated yard, picking up pieces of their lives the storm had scattered. A broken flower pot, a piece of the wooden fence, a framed photo of Jacob when he was 10, smiling with 2 front teeth missing, that had been hanging on the kitchen wall and now lay in the mud, the glass broken, the image water-stained. Mary had picked up that photo with trembling hands, had wiped the broken glass carefully not to cut herself, and had looked at that happy boy's face for a long time. It was cruel how the house still held his ghost. The pencil marks on the doorframe, measuring his height year by year, were still there, untouched by the storm. The old baseball glove gathering dust on the shelf, every object screamed of a love that used to exist. Mary ran her fingers over the height marks, stopping at the one labeled Jacob, 10 years old. She closed her eyes, and a single, heart-wrenching sob escaped her throat. It is a specific kind of grief to mourn a child who is still alive. It is a grief that has no closure, only a sharp, jagged edge that cuts you every time you remember who they used to be versus who they are now. It was cruel how the house still held his ghost. The pencil marks on the doorframe, measuring his height year by year, were still there, untouched by the storm. The old baseball glove gathering dust on the shelf, every object screamed of a love that used to exist. Mary ran her fingers over the height marks, stopping at the one labeled Jacob, 10 years old. She closed her eyes, and a single, heart-wrenching sob escaped her throat. It is a specific kind of grief to mourn a child who is still alive. It is a grief that has no closure, only a sharp, jagged edge that cuts you every time you remember who they used to be versus who they are now. That boy who used to run barefoot through these same streets, who played marbles with the neighbors' children, who helped his father in the fields on weekends, who sat on his grandfather Arthur's lap to hear stories of the old times. What had happened to that boy? At what exact moment had he become the man who yesterday had abandoned them without looking back? He wasn't always like this, Mary had murmured, more to herself than to Frank, still looking at the photo. There was a time when he loved us. Maybe he still loves us, Frank had replied, but his voice sounded hollow, without conviction. Maybe he just doesn't know how to show it. Mary had looked up at her husband, and in her eyes there was a sadness so deep it seemed like a bottomless well. Don't fool yourself, old man. A man who loves doesn't abandon. A man who loves doesn't take the dog and leave his parents in the middle of a storm. Whatever Jacob feels for us now is no longer love, it's something else. Frank walked to his tool shed, looking at the rows of hammers, saws, and wrenches he had used to build a life for his family. For the first time, they looked like alien artifacts. He had fixed fences, repaired roofs, and mended engines, but he realized with a crushing weight that he had failed to fix the one thing that mattered most, his son's character. He sat on an upturned bucket, burying his face in his rough hands. The shame burned hotter than the sun drying the mud outside. He asked the silent room the question that haunts every parent of an estranged child. Did I love him too little, or did I love him too much, shielding him from the rain so often that he never learned to fear the storm? There is no pain quite like a parent blaming themselves for a grown child's cruelty, wondering if their love was actually the mistake. Frank is tearing himself apart seeking answers in the silence of that shed. But the real answer isn't hidden in his past, it's waiting for him in a lawyer's office in Street Louis. Stay tuned, because Frank is about to stop questioning himself and start demanding the truth. Maybe obligation, maybe guilt, but not love. The words had fallen between them like stones in still water, creating waves of truth that hurt but could not be ignored. Frank had wanted to refute them, defend his son, find excuses, but he couldn't because deep down he knew Mary was right. He had seen Jacob's look the night before, that calculated coldness, that total lack of internal conflict when he made the decision to leave. A man divided between duty to his parents and fear for his family would have shown anguish, remorse, at least hesitation. Jacob had shown none of that. It had been an easy decision for him, almost automatic. The following days had been a blurry mix of cleaning, repairs, and silence. The neighbors had come to help, as always happened in the town when someone suffered a misfortune. Dale, the carpenter from the corner, had brought new boards to repair the windows. Mrs. Glenda had arrived with a hot casserole and fresh biscuits. The son of the Millers, a 20-year-old young man named Tyler, who worked in the city but had come to help his family after the storm, had spent an entire afternoon helping Frank clean the yard and rebuild the chicken coop. Tyler was everything Jacob no longer was: attentive, respectful, present. He listened to Frank's stories about what the town was like before, about the traditions that were being lost, about the importance of not forgetting where one came from. And while they worked together under the sun, which had returned to shine with relentless force, drying the mud and turning the streets into cracked earth, Frank couldn't help but think that life was unfair in its distributions. Frank walked to his tool shed, looking at the rows of hammers, saws, and wrenches he had used to build a life for his family. For the first time, they looked like alien artifacts. He had fixed fences, repaired roofs, and mended engines. But he realized with a crushing weight that he had failed to fix the one thing that mattered most: his son's character. He sat on an upturned bucket, burying his face in his rough hands. The shame burned hotter than the sun drying the mud outside. He asked the silent room the question that haunts every parent of an estranged child. Did I love him too little? Or did I love him too much, shielding him from the rain so often that he never learned to fear the storm? It was in the third week after the storm when Frank decided to act. He had woken up one morning with a mental clarity he hadn't felt in months, maybe years. He had dreamed of his father, Arthur, that night. In the dream, the old man was sitting in his favorite chair, the one that had been in the corner of the living room for decades until it rotted and they had to throw it out. Arthur looked at him with those penetrating eyes that always seemed to see more than one wanted to reveal, and said something Frank couldn't hear because the sound in the dream was distorted like a badly tuned radio. But the old man pointed insistently towards something, a specific place, and in the dream Frank knew exactly what it was. But upon waking, the memory had become diffuse, elusive. "I'm going to St. Louis," he had announced to Mary while they ate oatmeal and weak coffee. "I'm going to look for information about my father's will." Mary had stopped chewing and looked at him with a mix of surprise and worry. "To St. Louis? Old man, that trip is going to take all day, and the bus is expensive." "I don't care," Frank had replied with a determination that surprised them both. "I need to know. I need to understand what really happened with my father's inheritance. Jacob said there was nothing, but I know my dad. He wasn't one to leave things unresolved. There is something, I know it. And if Jacob lied..." He hadn't finished the sentence because the implication was too terrible to verbalize completely. "And if you find that there is something," Mary had asked quietly, "and if you discover that Jacob knew and didn't tell us, what are you going to do then?" Frank had looked at his old hands. Those hands that had worked the land for more than 60 years, that had built this house brick by brick, that had carried his son when he was a baby and waved goodbye when he went to college. "Then I'm going to ask him to look me in the eyes and tell me why. Not for the money, old girl. Never for the money, but for the truth. Because if my own son can steal from me, lie to me, and abandon me in the middle of a storm, then I need to know where I went wrong raising him. I need to know if it was my fault he became who he is." Tears had started to roll down Mary's wrinkled cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness only. There was also some relief in them, as if finally she could express everything she had been keeping inside for years. "It wasn't your fault, old man. We gave him everything. We gave him love, education, and values. We taught him to work hard, to be honest, and to respect his elders. If he decided to forget all that, if he decided money and status were more important than his family, that was his choice, not our failure." "Then I need to hear him say it," Frank had insisted. "I need him to explain exactly when he decided we were no longer worth his time, his love, his respect. Because it has to have been a specific moment, a conscious decision. People don't become like that suddenly." But in that Frank was wrong, though he wouldn't know it until much later. People do become like that, not suddenly, but gradually. So slowly they don't even realize the transformation themselves until it's too late. It's a process of small concessions, of minor justifications that accumulate like dust until they completely cover the person they used to be. Jacob hadn't woken up one day deciding to be cruel to his parents. He had started with small things, skipping a visit because he had work, cutting a call short because he had a meeting, lying about being busy when he simply didn't want to make the trip to the town. And every small disconnection had made the next one easier, until the distance between who he had been and who he was now had become an unbridgeable abyss. The next day, Frank had taken the bus to Street Lewis at 5 inches the morning. The trip had lasted almost 4 hours on roads that still showed the damage of the storm, with stretches where the asphalt had lifted and they had to drive slowly over packed dirt. The bus was full of folks like him. People traveling to the city, to sell produce, to look for work, to visit relatives. Frank had recognized several from town, and during the trip they had talked about the storm, the damage, the lost crops, but he hadn't mentioned the true purpose of his trip to any of them. That was something too personal, too painful to share with strangers. Street Louis had received him with its habitual chaos, dense traffic, constant horns, crowds of people moving with perpetual haste towards destinations that seemed always urgent. Frank had felt immediately out of place with his simple clothes, his worn boots, his old baseball cap. The city had grown enormously since the last time he visited, almost 10 years ago. Now there were new buildings rising towards the sky, like towers of glass and steel, immense malls that seemed like cities within the city, avenues so wide he was afraid to cross them. He had asked for directions several times until he reached the building where the law firm that had handled Arthur's legal affairs was located. It was an old building downtown, one of those that had survived modernization with a brick facade and a discreet sign that said, Eugene and Associates, Attorneys at Law. Frank had walked up the stairs slowly, his heart beating, not just from the physical effort, but from the anticipation and fear of what he might discover. The secretary, a middle-aged woman with glasses and an efficient expression, had looked at him with something that could have been condescension or simply professional curiosity when he explained, with a hesitant voice, that he came to ask about the will of his father, Arthur, deceased 5 years ago. "Do you have an ID?" she asked. And when Frank showed her his old and battered driver's license, she had examined it carefully before typing something into her computer. She had frowned, typed more, and then looked up at him with an expression Frank couldn't interpret. "One moment, Mr. Robles. I'm going to call the attorney." She had disappeared through a carved wooden door, and Frank had remained standing in the waiting room, too nervous to sit on the leather armchairs, which looked too elegant, too expensive for someone like him. The walls were covered with diplomas and certifications, photographs of the lawyer with important people, shelves full of legal books with leather spines. Everything in that place spoke of a world Frank didn't belong to, a world of laws and documents and formalities that were very far from his simple life in Willow Creek. When attorney Eugene finally came out, Frank was surprised. He had expected to find an older, severe, intimidating man. Instead, the lawyer was barely about 50 years old with gray hair at the temples, but a kind face. And when he shook Frank's hand, he did it with firmness, but also with warmth. "Mr. Robles," he had said, "it's been a long time. Please, come into my office." The office was spacious, with large windows overlooking the street, a solid mahogany desk covered with documents arranged in precise piles, and more shelves full of folders and files. Attorney Eugene had indicated for him to sit in one of the chairs in front of the desk, and then he himself had sat down, joining his hands on the desk with an expression Frank couldn't decipher. "Let me guess why you are here," the lawyer had said, and in his voice there was something that sounded almost like relief. "You're here to ask about your father's will, Arthur." "Yes, sir," Frank had replied, feeling his throat go dry. "My son Jacob, he's a lawyer, reviewed everything 5 years ago when my dad died. He said there was nothing, that the old man had died without leaving an inheritance, only debts. But I have doubts. I knew my father, and he wasn't one to leave things unresolved." Attorney Eugene had nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for this conversation for years. He had gotten up and walked to one of the filing cabinets. He had opened a drawer and taken out a thick folder, yellowed by time. When he returned to the desk and opened the folder, Frank could see it was full of documents, some with official seals, others with his father's handwriting he would recognize anywhere. "Mr. Robles," the lawyer had begun, choosing his words carefully. "What I'm about to tell you is delicate, very delicate, and is going to change a lot of what you think you know about your family." Frank's heart had started beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Tell me. I need to know the truth, whatever it is. Your father, Arthur, came to see me 12 years ago, not 5 when he died, but 12. He came because he wanted to make a very specific will, with very particular clauses. He told me he didn't fully trust his grandson, your son Jacob, although he loved him. He told me he had seen changes in the boy since he had gone to study in the city, changes that worried him, that Jacob had become ambitious, materialistic, that he spoke constantly of money and success, and that he almost never came to visit the town anymore. Frank had felt something tighten in his chest. His father had seen what he himself had tried to deny for years. Arthur wasn't poor, Mr. Robles. In fact, he was quite wealthy. He had invested smartly the money he earned with his businesses for decades. He had properties, bank accounts, investments, all very discreet, because he wasn't a man to show off. But his fortune was considerable, approximately $1.5 million. The number had fallen on Frank like an anvil. $1.5 million. His father, the man who lived in a modest house, who wore the same clothes for years, who never indulged in ostentatious luxuries, had $1.5, $2 million, and had never mentioned it. Why? Frank had managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. Why didn't he tell me? Because he wanted to prove something, the lawyer replied. He wanted to see if your son Jacob specifically, would treat you well without the promise of an inheritance. He wanted to know if the love was genuine or if it was interest. It was a test, Mr. Robles. A cruel test perhaps, but a test Arthur considered necessary. Sometimes, a father's protection looks like a test, and Arthur clearly saw the storm coming long before the clouds ever gathered. Stay tuned, because the trap Arthur set 5 years ago is about to snap shut, and the result will leave you speechless. And the will? Frank had asked, although he was already starting to fear the answer. Attorney Eugene had taken a document from the folder, several sheets joined with a clip, sealed and signed. The will clearly states that the entire fortune must go to you, Mr. Robles, as the sole direct heir. But there was a condition. The will could not be opened until 5 years after Arthur's death. During those 5 years, no one was to know of its existence. It was another test. Arthur wanted to see how his family would behave, especially Jacob, during that time, without the expectation of money. But Jacob reviewed everything, Frank had protested. He is a lawyer. He came here, spoke with you. He spoke with my secretary, the lawyer had corrected. I was out of town that month. I remember it well. And my secretary, following the specific instructions Arthur had left, told your son there was no registered will, which was technically true at that moment, because the will was sealed and could not be revealed until the 5 years passed. The room had started to spin around Frank. So, Jacob never knew? No, initially, the lawyer had said, and then had made a significant pause. But that changed 6 months ago. 6 months. Just before Jacob started visiting us more frequently, before that afternoon of the storm, before taking Thor with excuses of giving him a better life. What happened 6 months ago? Frank had asked, although he already felt he knew the answer, that all the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit into a terrible pattern. The 5-year term expired, the lawyer had explained. According to Arthur's instructions, I was to send a certified letter to your son Jacob, informing him of the existence of the will and citing him for the formal reading. The letter was sent, and I have here the return receipt, confirming he received it personally. The lawyer had taken out another document from the folder, a receipt with Jacob's signature clearly visible, dated exactly 6.5 months ago. Your son received the notification, Mr. Robles. He knows the will exists. He knows there is a considerable inheritance. And according to Arthur's instructions, the reading of the will was to take place 6 months after that notification, in the presence of all direct heirs, who in this case are you and your wife Mary. The date of the reading is... He had consulted the calendar on his desk. Next Monday, September 22nd, in 4 days. Frank had felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. Jacob knew. He had known for 6 months, and in all that time, he hadn't said a single word. Not even when he abandoned them in the storm. Not even when he took Thor. Not even in the scarce and cold phone calls they had exchanged. He had kept the secret. He had kept the silence. Waiting. Waiting for what? There is something else, the lawyer had continued, and his voice had become even more serious. Arthur included a very specific clause in the will, a clause that depended on how Jacob behaved during these 5 years, and especially after receiving the notification of the will. Your father asked me to investigate discreetly, to document the visits, the calls, the treatment you received from your son. He gave me resources to hire someone who could do this tracking without being detected. You spied on us? Frank had asked, stunned. Not exactly a spy. More like a document. Your father wanted objective evidence, and I complied with his will. During these 5 years, and especially during the last 6 months, I have maintained a record of every visit from Jacob, every phone call, every interaction. I also hired a private investigator who documented certain important events. The lawyer had taken out another folder, this one thinner, but just as shocking. He had opened it on the desk, revealing photographs, call transcripts, dated reports. And there, among all those documents, were photographs of that stormy afternoon, photographs of the black Ford driving away from Frank and Mary, standing in the doorway of their house, soaked and abandoned. Photographs taken by some neighbor who had been hired without them knowing, documenting the exact moment their son had left them alone in the middle of the worst storm in 30 years. How? Frank had started, but hadn't been able to finish the question. Dale, your neighbor, the lawyer had explained. The father of the young man who helped you repair your house after the storm. Arthur contacted him 12 years ago, explained the situation, paid him in advance for his services. Dale has been my eyes in Willow Creek all these years. And let me tell you, Mr. Robles, that what he documented, especially that afternoon of the storm, is more than enough to activate the special clause of the will. What clause? Frank had asked, feeling he could no longer absorb more surprises, but knowing there was more to come. Attorney Eugene had taken the will, flipped several pages until reaching a specific section, and had begun to read with a clear and professional voice. If my grandson Jacob Robles demonstrates during the probation period of 5 years, and especially after being notified of the existence of this will, that he has neglected, mistreated, or abandoned my children Frank and Mary in their old age, if he demonstrates placing material interest above the well-being of his parents, if at any moment during this period he commits an act of cruelty, negligence, or abandonment towards them that is documented and verifiable, then the following provision will be activated. Jacob Robles will be completely excluded as an heir to my estate. Instead, the entirety of my fortune will be divided as follows: 60% for Frank and Mary Robles for their well-being and security in old age, 30% for charities designated to help abandoned elderly people in the state of Missouri, and 10% for Dale and his family as gratitude for their loyalty and service in documenting the truth. The silence in the office had been absolute. Frank could hear the wall clock ticking the seconds, the distant sound of traffic on the street, his own ragged breathing. His father, Arthur, had planned all this. He had created a moral test for his grandson, a test Jacob had failed spectacularly without even knowing it. My father knew, Frank had whispered finally. He knew exactly what kind of man Jacob had become. Arthur was a very perceptive man, the lawyer had confirmed. Very protective of you. He told me the last time we saw each other before his death that he hoped to be wrong about Jacob, that he hoped his grandson would prove to be better than he feared. But he also told me that if he was right, if Jacob really had become someone capable of putting money above family, then he didn't deserve a penny of his inheritance. Frank had extended a trembling hand towards the photographs of that stormy afternoon. He had looked at them with eyes that now understood much more than they wanted to. There he was with Mary, 2 small and soaked figures, watching their son drive away. There was the irrefutable evidence of an abandonment that would now have legal, financial, moral consequences. Does Jacob know about this clause? He had asked. Not specifically. The letter he received only mentioned the existence of the will and the date of the reading. It didn't detail the conditions, but I suppose as a lawyer he must suspect that such a carefully structured will, with a 5-year waiting period, probably contains conditional clauses. And even so, Frank hadn't been able to finish the question because the answer was obvious. Even so, knowing there was a will, that there was money at stake, Jacob had abandoned them in the storm. He had chosen his comfort and his security over that of his elderly parents. He had failed the test in the most definitive way possible. Mr. Robles, the lawyer had said gently, I know this is a lot to process. I know it hurts to discover these truths about your son, but on Monday you must be here, you and your wife, for the formal reading of the will. It is your right. It is your inheritance, and it is what your father wanted." Frank had nodded mechanically, his mind still trying to absorb everything he had heard. $1.5 million. A moral test, a son who had failed, a father who had seen the future with painful clarity, and in 4 days all this would become public. Everything would come to light, and Jacob would have to face the consequences of his actions. "Can I ask you a question?" Frank had said finally, his voice hoarse from contained emotion. "Of course. Do you think Jacob suspects anything? Do you think that's why he came to visit us that afternoon, just before the storm?" The lawyer had considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know for certain, but basing myself on my experience with similar cases, I would say your son probably was trying to establish an appearance of filial attention before the reading of the will. Maybe he thought a recent visit would make his relationship with you look good. What he didn't calculate was that the storm would put him in a situation where he would have to choose, and that choice would be documented." It was a cruel irony, Frank thought. Jacob had tried to manipulate the situation in his favor, and, instead, had created the perfect evidence of exactly what his grandfather had feared he was, a man capable of abandoning his parents in their moment of greatest need. When Frank finally left the law firm, it was already mid-afternoon. The street Louis' sun beat down on the pavement with force, making the glass buildings shine until blinding. The city continued with its frenetic rhythm, thousands of people moving around him, each with their own lives, their own dramas, their own betrayals and redemptions. But for Frank, everything had become silent, as if an invisible bell jar isolated him from the rest of the world. He walked aimlessly for a while, paying no attention to where he was going, his feet taking him automatically through streets he didn't recognize. His mind was a whirlwind of contradictory emotions: rage towards his son for having treated them so badly, for having failed a moral test he didn't even know he was taking, sadness for the broken family, for the boy Jacob had been and the man he had become, gratitude towards his father for having protected them even after death, for having seen what Frank had been too blind to see, and above all, an overwhelming sensation of vindication, of justice finally served, although it came mixed with the pain of knowing that justice was necessary. He found himself in a park, sitting on a bench under the shade of an old oak, watching families pass by. Young parents with children in strollers, grandparents walking slowly, holding hands, teenagers in noisy groups. The normal life of normal people who loved and were loved back. And Frank wondered, not for the first time, but with more intensity than ever, where exactly the love between him and his son had broken. Had it been when Jacob went to college and discovered a bigger world? When he met Ashley and her rich family and became ashamed of his humble origins? When he had the twins and decided they shouldn't grow up knowing the poverty he had known? Maybe, Frank thought with a sadness that hurt in his bones. Maybe it has always been like this. Maybe Jacob had always had that coldness inside him, that capacity to put his interests above everything else. And he and Mary simply hadn't seen it because they didn't want to see it, because accepting that would be accepting that they had failed as parents, that something essential had failed in raising their son. But Arthur had seen it. His father, with that clear vision that comes from having lived much and seen more, had recognized the signs they had ignored and had done what he believed necessary to protect them. Even if that protection came wrapped in secrets and moral tests and conditional inheritances. The sun began to set, staining the sky orange and purple, and Frank finally got up from the bench. He had to go back to Willow Creek. He had to tell Mary everything. Together, they would have to decide how to proceed, how to face what was coming on Monday at the law firm, how to handle the inevitable confrontation with Jacob. The trip back on the bus was long and silent. Frank had sat next to the window watching how the landscape changed gradually from urban to rural, the buildings giving way to open fields, the noise of the city replaced by the silence of the country. The other passengers dozed or spoke in low voices, but no one bothered Frank, perhaps because something in his expression made clear he wasn't in the mood for conversation. When he finally arrived home, past midnight, Mary was awake waiting for him. A single candle lit the kitchen where she sat, her hands around a cup of cold tea, her face showing every one of her 72 years under the flickering light. "Tell me," she had said simply when Frank entered, and he told her everything. Every word from the lawyer, every document, every photograph, every clause of Arthur's will. He spoke for almost an hour, his voice sometimes breaking, other times becoming hard with contained rage. And Mary listened without interrupting, her hands squeezing tighter and tighter around the cup until her knuckles turned white. When Frank finally finished, the silence stretched between them like a heavy blanket. Then, to Frank's surprise, Mary started to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh, but something darker, more bitter. The laugh of someone who finally understands a cruel joke the universe has been telling for years. "Your father was always smarter than all of us put together," she had said finally, wiping tears she didn't know were from laughter or crying. "He saw what we didn't want to see and protected us the only way he knew how." "Do you think Jacob will come on Monday?" Frank had asked. "Oh, he'll come," Mary had replied with absolute certainty. "He'll come because he thinks he's going to inherit, because for 6 months he's been counting that money in his head, planning what to do with it. Maybe he's even made promises based on that inheritance. He'll come because ambition always comes when there's money involved." Mary hits the nail on the head. Greed has a way of blinding people to the danger standing right in front of them. Jacob is rushing to that law firm with dollar signs in his eyes, completely unaware that he is walking into a trap set 12 years ago. You won't want to miss the moment the trap finally snaps shut. So keep listening, justice is about to be served cold. And what are we going to do when he discovers the truth? Mary had looked at her husband with eyes that had seen too much, that had cried too much, but that now contained something new. Determination. "We're going to look him in the eyes while the lawyer reads the will. We're going to see his face when he understands what he has lost, and then, if he has any decency left, if there's anything left of the boy we raised, we'll give him the chance to explain himself, to apologize, to try to repair what he broke. But if not," she had left the sentence unfinished, but both knew what it meant. If not, then Jacob would have lost not only his grandfather's inheritance, but also any connection that still existed with his parents. The following days passed with agonizing slowness. Frank and Mary did their daily chores, took care of the yard that still showed damage from the storm. They spoke with the neighbors who knew nothing of the drama unfolding. Dale, the neighbor who had been Arthur's eyes all these years, had come to visit them and told them his part of the story. How Arthur had contacted him so many years ago, how he had explained he needed someone trusted to document the truth without being detected. "I didn't like doing it at first," Dale had admitted, sitting on the same sofa where Jacob's twins had been glued to their phones. "It felt like betraying the trust of neighbors." But Arthur explained it wasn't about spying, but about protecting. "He told me if Jacob really treated you well, then there would be nothing to document, and the money would be for him anyway. But if he treated you badly, you deserve to be protected." "Thank you," Frank had said simply, and in that word there was a world of meaning. "Thank you for being loyal. Thank you for documenting the truth. Thank you for being the witness we needed when no one else was looking." On Sunday night, neither Frank nor Mary could sleep. They stayed awake in their bed, holding hands in the dark, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the town. Dogs barking in the distance, the wind moving the leaves of the apple tree, the occasional car passing on the street. They talked about Arthur, remembering stories from when he was alive, his silent wisdom, his love disguised as severity. They talked about Jacob when he was a boy, about the good things they remembered, because despite everything, there had been good moments, good years before everything changed. "Do you think there's any way this ends well?" Mary had asked at some point in the early morning. "No," Frank had replied with brutal honesty. "There's no way this ends well, but it can end with truth, and sometimes the truth is the only thing we have left when everything else is gone." Monday dawned clear and hot, no clouds in the sky, as if the storm from 3 weeks ago had never existed. Frank and Mary had gotten up early, dressed in their best clothes, him in his only suit kept in the closet since Arthur's funeral, which fit a bit loose now because he had lost weight with age. She in a dark blue dress that had been her church dress for years, ironed carefully without wrinkles. They looked at each other before leaving, really seeing each other perhaps for the first time in years, and saw in the other the same mix of fear and courage. "Together," Mary had said, taking her husband's hand. "Together," Frank had confirmed. And so, holding hands, they had left their humble house towards a bus that would take them to Street Louis, towards a law firm where the truth would be revealed, towards a confrontation that would change everything forever. Arthur's will was about to be read, and with it all the secrets he had kept for 12 years. The hour of truth had finally arrived. The conference room of the law firm was on the second floor of the old brick building, a wide space with a long, polished mahogany table that shone under the light of an antique chandelier. The walls were lined with shelves full of legal tomes bound in leather, and an oil portrait of Abraham Lincoln looked severely from its golden frame, as if silently judging everyone who entered. Frank and Mary had arrived half an hour before the scheduled appointment, nervous, clinging to each other like castaways to a plank in the middle of the ocean. Attorney Eugene had received them personally. He had guided them to their seats at the table, on the side facing the door, and offered them water, coffee, something to eat. They had refused everything politely, their stomachs too tight with anxiety to accept anything. The secretary had entered briefly to leave a thick folder in front of the lawyer. She had exchanged a few words in a low voice with him, and then left, closing the door softly. "Does he know we'll be here?" Mary had asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The summons mentions that the reading of the will be performed in the presence of all potential heirs," the lawyer had replied. "So yes, he should expect you, although I don't know if he will." It was 10:05 a.m. when they heard footsteps coming up the stairs, firm, sure steps of expensive shoes on marble. Frank felt his heart start to beat so hard, surely everyone in the room could hear it. Mary squeezed his hand with such force her fingers turned white, and then the door opened. Jacob entered as he always did, with that professional confidence he had cultivated for years, dressed in a perfectly cut charcoal gray suit, navy blue tie, Italian leather briefcase under his arm, his hair impeccably combed back with gel, his beard trimmed immaculately, and wearing dark sunglasses he didn't take off until completely inside the room. When he finally took them off and saw his parents sitting on the other side of the table, his expression went through a series of emotions in fractions of a second. Surprise, confusion, something that could have been guilt, and finally a mask of professional neutrality. "Dad? Mom?" he had said, and his voice sounded controlled, almost clinical. "I didn't know you would also be here. It's the reading of your grandfather's will," Frank had replied. And it was surprising how firm his voice came out despite the trembling he felt inside. "We are the direct heirs. Where else were we going to be?" Something had flickered in Jacob's eyes, something fast, like the flash of a knife under electric light, but it had disappeared as quickly as it arrived. He had sat at the other end of the table, taken out a legal pad and a Mont Blanc pen from his briefcase, and adopted that posture of a lawyer in a business meeting. Back straight, hand on the table, expression attentive but distant. "Well," Attorney Eugene had said, breaking the tense silence that had settled in the room, "now that all interested parties are present, we can proceed. As you know, we are here for the reading of the will of Arthur Robles, deceased 5 years and 4 months ago. The will was drafted 12 years ago under my supervision and certification, and in accordance with the testator's specific instructions, could not be opened until 5 years passed since his death." Jacob had nodded, taking notes on his pad with that small and tight handwriting he used for legal documents. He hadn't looked at his parents once since sitting down. The lawyer had opened the thick folder in front of him, taken out the sealed will, and with ceremonial movements broken the official seals that had kept it closed for so long. The paper rustled in the absolute silence of the room as he unfolded the documents. Before proceeding with the reading, the lawyer had continued, "I must inform you that this will contains conditional clauses. That is, the distribution of assets depends on certain circumstances that had to be verified during the period following Arthur's death." Now Jacob had looked up, and Frank could see a flash of something in his eyes. Worry? Fear? It was hard to know behind that professional mask his son wore like armor. "What type of conditional clauses?" Jacob had asked, his lawyer voice in full operation, analytical, looking for legal loopholes even before knowing the terms. "Clauses related to the behavior and treatment of the heirs towards the testator's parents," the lawyer had replied, looking at Jacob directly. Arthur was very specific in his instructions. The silence that followed was so dense it could be cut with a knife. Frank saw Jacob's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, how his knuckles turned white around the expensive pen he held. His son wasn't stupid. As an experienced lawyer, he was probably already understanding that something wasn't going to go as he had expected. Attorney Eugene had begun to read, his clear and professional voice filling the room. "I, Arthur Robles, being of sound mind, having reached 78 years of age and enjoying reasonable health, dictate my last will in this document, with full knowledge that death may arrive at any moment, and wishing to leave my affairs in order. It was strange, Frank thought, hearing his father's words read by another person 5 years after that voice had been silenced forever. He closed his eyes for a moment, and almost could see Arthur sitting in that same office 12 years ago, dictating these words with that iron determination that had characterized him all his life. First, I wish to declare that my estate consists of the following: a bank account in Bank of America with a balance of approximately $400,000, stocks and investments in various financial instruments for an estimated value of $700,000. 3 real estate properties in the city of St. Louis, valued jointly at $400,000, and various personal property and effects. The total estimated value of my estate is approximately $1.5 million. Jacob had dropped his pen. The sound of metal hitting the wooden table had resonated like a gunshot in the silence of the room. Frank saw his son staring at the lawyer, his mouth slightly open, his expression of absolute shock. Clearly, despite knowing there was an inheritance, he hadn't expected it to be of such magnitude. $1. $5 million, Jacob had murmured almost to himself. Yes, the lawyer had confirmed. Arthur was a very prudent man with his investments. Now, if you allow me to continue, he had turned to the next page, and Frank could see there were several more to read. His father's will wasn't a simple document. It was a complete treatise, thought out carefully, every word chosen with purpose. Second, I wish to explain the reasons for the provisions I will establish in this document. During my life, I have witnessed how money changes people, how the promise of an inheritance can turn loving children into vultures waiting for their parents' death. I have seen families destroyed by ambition, by greed, by forgetting the fundamental values that should guide our lives. The lawyer's voice had become more solemn, as if he himself felt the weight of the words he was reading. My son Frank has been a good man all his life, hardworking, honest, dedicated to his family. Together with his wife Mary, they raised my grandson Jacob with love and sacrifice, selling even land that was their livelihood to give him a university education. However, I have observed with increasing sadness how Jacob has drifted from his roots since he went to study in the city. The visits have become scarce, the phone calls brief and obligatory, and I have noticed in his eyes that look I have seen before in others, the look of someone ashamed of where he comes from. Frank felt tears burn his eyes. His father had seen it all, understood it all, even the things he himself had tried to deny. I don't want to judge my grandson prematurely, continued Arthur's voice through the lawyer. It's possible it's just a phase, that he matures and remembers what is truly important. That is why I have decided to create a test, not cruel, but necessary. A test that will reveal his true character. Jacob had gotten up from his chair, walking towards the window, turning his back to them. His shoulders were tense, his hands clenched in fists at his sides, but he hadn't interrupted, hadn't protested, because as a lawyer he knew, interrupting the reading of a will wouldn't change its content. Therefore, I established the following provisions. This will remain sealed for 5 years after my death. During that time, no one will know of its existence. I want my family to live those 5 years without the expectation of inheritance, without the corrupting influence of knowing there is money waiting for them. I want to see through the eyes of trusted people I have designated how Jacob treats his elderly parents when there is nothing to gain from treating them well. The lawyer had paused, taken a sip of water, and then continued with what was clearly the central part of the will. After 5 years, Attorney Eugene will send a certified letter to Jacob, informing him of the existence of this will and citing him for its reading 6 months later. Those 6 months will be crucial because now Jacob will know there is an inheritance, will know there is money at stake, and his behavior during that period will reveal if the knowledge of the inheritance changes his treatment towards his parents. If a man treats his parents well only when he expects to inherit, that is not love, it is investment. And I do not reward investments in my family. Mary had started to cry silently, tears rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. Frank had passed her a handkerchief he carried in the pocket of his old suit, and she had accepted it without taking her eyes off the lawyer, who continued reading. I have commissioned Mr. Dale, neighbor and trusted friend of Frank and Mary in Willow Creek, to discreetly document all interactions between Jacob and his parents during these 5.5 years. Visits, phone calls, financial help if any, emotional support, anything that demonstrates the level of care and attention Jacob provides to his parents in their old age. Mr. Dale will receive compensation for this service and report regularly to Attorney Eugene. Jacob had turned sharply from the window, his face now clearly showing the rage he had been containing. You spied on me. You hired someone to spy on me? Not to spy on you, Mr. Robles. The lawyer had intervened with professional calm to document objective facts. The visits you made or failed to make, the calls you gave or didn't give, the important events in your parents' lives where you were or were not present. No private conversations were recorded, nor was any privacy law violated. Only what any neighbor could have observed naturally was documented. This can't be legal, Jacob had protested, his lawyer voice emerging, looking for angles to attack. A will cannot be conditioned on this type of surveillance. I assure you it is completely legal, Attorney Eugene had replied. The testator has the right to condition his inheritance on almost any requirement that does not violate laws or public order, and leaving an inheritance based on the treatment heirs give to the testator's parents is not only legal, but has precedence in multiple cases I can cite if you wish. Jacob had pressed his lips together, clearly recognizing the lawyer was right. He had sat back down, but now his posture was different. Defensive, tense, like a defendant waiting for the verdict. Let's continue, the lawyer had said, returning to the will. Based on the reports I received from Mr. Dale and Attorney Eugene, I established two possible scenarios for the distribution of my estate. The silence in the room was so complete Frank could hear his own breathing, his heartbeats, the slight creak of the chair when Mary moved slightly. Scenario 1. If Jacob demonstrates during these 5.5 years that he has maintained a loving, attentive, and respectful relationship with his parents, if he has visited them regularly, if he has supported them financially and emotionally according to their needs, if he has allowed his children to know and love their grandparents, if in general he has acted like a son who honors his parents regardless of any expectation of inheritance, then the distribution will be as follows: 40% of the estate for Frank and Mary, 50% for Jacob, and 10% for Mr. Dale as gratitude for his services. Frank had seen a flash of hope cross his son's face, a quick calculation of how much 50% of $1.5 million meant, $750,000. It was a fortune that would completely change his life, ensure his children's future, allow him all the luxuries he clearly valued so much. Scenario 2, the lawyer had continued, and his voice had become graver, more serious. If Jacob demonstrates negligence, indifference, or abandonment towards his parents, if visits are scarce or non-existent, if calls are brief and obligatory, if he does not provide support when necessary, if he treats his parents like an inconvenient obligation instead of the people who sacrificed everything for him, or if especially he commits any specific act of cruelty, abandonment, or neglect that is documented. The lawyer had paused, looking at Jacob directly in the eyes before continuing. In that case, Jacob Robles will be completely excluded as an heir. The entirety of my estate will be distributed thus: 60% for Frank and Mary Robles to ensure their well-being in the old age their son neglected, 30% to establish a charity fund dedicated to helping elderly people abandoned by their families in the state of Missouri, administered by Attorney Eugene, and 10% for Dale and his family, doubling his compensation as recognition for the service of documenting painful truths. The color had drained completely from Jacob's face. He had remained motionless like a statue of salt, his eyes fixed on the lawyer but without really seeing him, processing the implications of what he had just heard. And now, Attorney Eugene had said, taking out another folder, this one thicker, full of documents and photographs, I will proceed to present the evidence collected during the 5.5 years established by the will to determine which of the two scenarios applies in this case. He had opened the folder and begun taking out documents, organizing them on the table so everyone could see them. Photographs, dated reports, transcripts of conversations with neighbors, phone call logs obtained legally with Frank and Mary's consent. During the first year after Arthur's death, the lawyer had begun. Jacob visited his parents on 3 occasions. The first visit lasted approximately 2 hours, the other 2 less than an hour each. During this period he made 6 phone calls, all brief, less than 5 minutes in duration. He had shown a detailed log, precise dates and times, notes on the duration and tone of interactions, as reported by Dale and other neighbors who had observed the visits. Year 2. 2 visits lasting 1 hour or less each, 5 phone calls. None of the visits coincided with important dates like birthdays or anniversaries. Jacob had begun to shake his head, his mouth opening as if to protest, but no word came out. What could he say? The numbers were irrefutable, cold, objective in their cruelty. Year 3. One brief visit during Christmas that lasted 3 hours, but of which Jacob spent most of on his cell phone, handling work matters. 4 phone calls. During this year, Frank suffered a fall in the field that fractured a rib. He called Jacob to inform him. Jacob said he would go visit, but never arrived. He sent money for the doctor, $100, which was appreciated, but did not replace his presence. Mary had let out a sob hearing this. Frank remembered perfectly that incident, the pain of the fractured rib paling beside the pain of waiting day after day for his son to arrive, until finally he accepted he wouldn't come. Year 4. No visits. 3 phone calls. In this year, Mary was hospitalized for 3 days due to a severe infection. Jacob was informed, didn't visit the hospital, sent flowers. The words were like stabs, each revealing a truth Frank and Mary had lived but never fully verbalized. They had never allowed it to solidify into documented reality. Year 5. One brief visit during Easter. 2 phone calls. Attorney Eugene closed the file regarding the 5-year period and looked up, his expression hardening. That concludes the observation of the mandatory waiting period. However, he paused, reaching for a separate, sealed, manila envelope. There is a final addendum regarding the events of August 15th, just 3 weeks ago. He opened the envelope and slid several glossy 8x10 photographs across the mahogany table towards Jacob. Frank felt time stop. There they were, captured in high resolution, the black Ford driving away, the rain hammering down, and 2 elderly figures standing soaked and abandoned in their doorway. On August 15th, the incident occurred that I consider definitive for determining the applicable scenario, Attorney Eugene had said, his voice loaded with barely contained disapproval. Jacob visited his parents with his family, including the German Shepherd dog that Frank had raised from a puppy and that Jacob had taken months ago with the promise of taking better care of it. He had placed the first photographs on the table, showing the arrival of the black Ford, Jacob and his family entering the humble farmhouse. At 5:30 p.m., a severe storm began, the worst that had hit the region in 30 years. Frank and Mary's house, although solid, began to suffer leaks. Conditions became dangerous. At that moment, Jacob made a decision. The following series of photographs showed the complete sequence. The SUV preparing to leave, Jacob with the dog, Frank and Mary in the doorway, soaked, watching them leave. Despite the pleas of his elderly parents to stay, despite his mother begging him not to drive in the storm, despite his father literally telling him, "Don't leave us alone," Jacob chose to leave. He took his family, including the dog, and abandoned his parents, aged 74 and 72, in the middle of a storm that left several dead in the region and caused extensive damage. The lawyer had let the photographs speak for themselves, scattered on the table like evidence in a criminal trial. Attorney Eugene pulled out a handwritten affidavit signed by Dale, the neighbor. He began to read aloud, his voice steady but heavy with judgment. I was watching from my porch, ready to run over and help Frank reinforce his door. The wind was already tearing branches off the oak trees. I saw Jacob's SUV engine running. I saw Frank reaching out, grabbing his son's arm, not aggressively, but like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. And I saw Jacob shake him off. There is a profound and painful satisfaction in seeing the truth finally come to light, even when it hurts to look at. But don't click away yet, because Jacob's reaction to this devastating loss might just surprise you more than the inheritance itself. He didn't just leave. He accelerated. His tires spun mud onto his own father's trousers. I have never seen a man look so small as Frank did, standing in that rain, watching his flesh and blood choose a leather interior over his parents' lives. That wasn't just abandonment. It was a sentence to death that they miraculously survived. And in a way, this was a trial, Frank thought. A moral trial, where his son was being judged not by the law of the state, but by the oldest law of all, the law of respect and love that children owe their parents. This action, Attorney Eugene had continued, fully meets the definition of a specific act of cruelty, abandonment, or neglect established in Arthur's will. Jacob put his own comfort and that of his immediate family above the safety of his elderly parents. He showed no conflict, showed no remorse, did not call later to verify if they had survived the storm. He simply left. Jacob had finally found his voice, and when he spoke, his tone was defensive, desperate. The house was dangerous. It could have collapsed. I had to protect my children. The house held up perfectly. The lawyer had replied with implacable calm, just as your father told you it would. And if you really feared for your children's safety, the obvious option was to take your parents too. Your SUV had enough room for 7 people. There was room for everyone. The argument had fallen like a guillotine. Jacob had shut his mouth abruptly because there was no defense against that simple truth. He had had the option to save his whole family and had chosen to save only those who suited him. Therefore, the lawyer had said, gathering all the documents and photographs, based on the evidence presented and in accordance with the terms clearly established in the will of Arthur Robles, I determine that Scenario 2 applies. Jacob Robles is completely excluded as heir to his grandfather's estate. The words had resonated in the room like funeral bells. $750,000. The fortune Jacob had been counting in his mind for months had just evaporated like smoke, all for a series of selfish decisions, for a pattern of negligence that had culminated in an act of abandonment that no will could forgive. Jacob had stood up so abruptly that his chair had fallen backward with a crash. His face had gone from pale to deep red. His hands shook with rage or shock or a combination of both. "This is a farce," he had shouted. His professional voice was completely destroyed, replaced by something more primitive, more desperate. "My grandfather can't do this. He can't judge me from the grave. He can't decide I don't deserve what is rightfully mine." "It wasn't yours by right," Attorney Eugene had corrected, his voice still calm but now with an edge of steel. "It was your grandfather's, and he had every right to distribute it as he saw fair. You knew the will existed for 6 months, Mr. Robles. You had 6 months to prove you could be the grandson, the son that Arthur hoped you would be. And instead, you committed the clearest possible act of abandonment. It wasn't the will that excluded you from the inheritance. It was your own actions." Jacob had then turned towards his parents, and on his face there was something wild, something Frank had never seen before and hoped never to see again. "Did you know? Did you know about this damn manipulative will?" "We found out 4 days ago," Frank had replied, and his voice was firm, even though his whole body was trembling. "Your grandfather told us nothing when he was alive. He wanted to protect us, but he also wanted to protect you and give you the chance to show who you really were without the influence of money. And what am I then?" Jacob had spat the words out like poison. "According to the saint of my dead grandfather and his perfect will?" Frank had stood up slowly. He had walked around the table until he was in front of his son. Jacob was nearly a head taller than him, younger, stronger, more successful by all the world's standards. But in that moment, standing in front of him, Frank felt bigger, stronger, because he had something his son had lost: dignity. "You are a man who abandoned his parents in the middle of a storm," Frank had said, every word measured, every syllable loaded with 50 years of betrayed love. "You are a man who took the dog I raised, but left us behind. You are a man who for 5 years barely visited us, who forgot our birthdays, who didn't come when I was hurt, who sent flowers when your mother almost died. You are a man who, when he finally knew there was money involved, tried to fake interest in us as if we were a contract he needed to keep valid until cashing out." Every accusation had been a slap, and Frank could see his son shrinking with each one, not physically, but in some deeper way, as if he were finally really seeing what he had done, who he had become. Jacob had started, but Mary had stood up too. She had walked over to stand next to her husband and had raised a hand to silence him. "Don't you dare," she had said, and her voice contained a maternal ferocity she hadn't shown in years. "Don't you dare make excuses now. Don't you dare tell us you had your reasons, that you were busy, that your life in the city is complicated. We raised a boy who ran barefoot through dusty streets, who shared his last biscuit with stray dogs, who cried when he saw injustices. Where did that boy go, Jacob? When exactly did you decide money was worth more than the family that gave you everything?" Jacob had opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. But no words came out because there were no words that could defend the indefensible. The truth was there, scattered on the mahogany table in photographs and documents, irrefutable and incriminating. "I'm going to fight this," he had said finally, but his voice had lost all its previous strength. "I'm going to take this will to court. I'm going to prove it's manipulative, that it violates my rights as a legitimate heir. It is your right, Attorney Eugene had said. You can appeal to the courts if you wish. But I warn you that this will was drafted following all applicable laws, certified by multiple authorities, and the conditional clauses are well within what the law allows. Furthermore, you would have to argue before a judge that photographs of you abandoning your elderly parents in a deadly storm do not constitute valid evidence of your character. I wish you luck with that. Defeat had fallen over Jacob like a heavy cloak. His shoulders had slumped, his professional posture had collapsed, and suddenly he looked older than his 45 years. He looked tired and emptied and broken in a way no amount of money could fix. He had picked up his briefcase in silence. He had walked towards the door with steps that were no longer sure, but hesitant. But before leaving, he had stopped. He had turned to look at his parents one last time. "Is this what you wanted?" he had asked. And in his voice there was something that could have been genuine pain or could have been just disguised rage. "To destroy me. To take away what should be mine." "The only thing we wanted," Frank had replied with a sadness so deep it hurt to breathe, "was for you to love us without conditions, without inheritances in between, without expectations of reward. Just for you to love us as we loved you, with everything we had." But clearly that was asking too much. Jacob had been about to say something else, his mouth forming words that never came out. Then, without another word, he had left the conference room, gone down the stairs, and left, leaving behind not only an inheritance of $1.5 million, but also the last remnants of the relationship with his parents. The silence that had remained in the room after his departure was of the kind that follows tragedies, heavy and complete. Frank and Mary had remained standing, still holding hands, watching the door where their son had disappeared, processing the end of a relationship that technically hadn't ended, but both knew would never be the same. "We did the right thing," Mary had whispered finally. "I don't know," Frank had admitted. "But we did what your father-in-law thought necessary. We let the truth come to light. And now Jacob will have to decide what to do with that truth, whether he accepts it and tries to redeem himself or rejects it and is completely lost." Attorney Eugene had given them time to process, to breathe. Before continuing with the practical aspects of the reading of the will, he had explained the details of how they would receive their share of the inheritance, the legal steps that would follow, the tax implications. He had spoken about the charity fund that would be established to help other abandoned elderly people, a legacy Arthur wanted to leave so his story, his foresight, would serve more people than just his own family. When they finally left the law firm, it was already mid-afternoon. The Street Lewis sun shone relentlessly, indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded in that brick building. Life continued around them, people walking hurriedly, street vendors shouting their products, traffic roaring on the wide avenues. Frank and Mary walked without a particular direction for a while, needing to process, needing to feel the real world after hours in that space of painful truths and cold justice. Eventually, they found a small diner on a side street, one of those humble places where working people eat honest food for reasonable prices. They entered, ordered chili and cornbread, and ate in silence, the familiar taste of traditional food anchoring them back to who they were, to where they came from. "We aren't poor anymore," Mary had said suddenly, looking at her bowl of chili as if it were something strange and wonderful. "After a lifetime of counting every penny, of worrying about every expense, of living day to day, we aren't poor anymore." "No," Frank had confirmed, "but we aren't rich either. Money isn't going to change us, old girl. We remain the same. We're going to use that money to live with dignity in our last years, to fix the house, to not worry anymore about doctors or medicines, and the rest. The rest we will use to help others who need it, as your father-in-law would have wanted." Mary had felt tears rolling silently down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness or joy, but something more complex, a mixture of relief and loss, of justice obtained at a terrible cost. "Do you think he'll come back?" she had asked. "Do you think Jacob will try to fix things?" Frank had thought a long time before answering, remembering the look in his son's eyes when he left the conference room, that mix of rage and shame and pain. "I don't know," he had admitted finally. "Maybe yes, when the shock passes, when he accepts what he lost and why he lost it. Or maybe not, if his pride is bigger than his capacity to see his mistakes. But that depends on him now. We did what we could. We raised him the best we knew how. The rest of his path he has to walk alone." They had finished their meal, paid with worn $20 bills taken from Mary's old purse, because they were still who they had always been, even though the balance in their bank account was about to change soon. And then they had walked towards the bus station to take the bus back to Willow Creek, to their humble farmhouse, which now they could repair completely, to their simple lives, which now would be a little less difficult. On the bus back, while the landscape changed from urban to rural under the golden light of sunset, Frank had thought of his father, Arthur, the man who had orchestrated all this from beyond the grave. He had thought of the wisdom of creating that test, of the tough love required to expose ugly truths instead of burying them in silence. He had thought of how money reveals character instead of creating it, how it simply amplifies what is already there. And he had thought with a mix of sadness and peace that his father had been right. Jacob had shown who he really was, not out of innate malice, but because of a series of small choices that had accumulated until turning him into someone capable of abandoning his parents in a storm. And although it hurt, although it broke the heart, it was better to know the truth than to live in illusion. When they arrived in Willow Creek, it was already night. The town was quiet, the dirt roads lit barely by sporadic streetlights, the houses with their warm lights filtering through windows and doors. Dale was sitting on his porch, as he always did at night, and when he saw Frank and Mary pass, he had gotten up, walked towards them. "How did it go?" he had asked simply. "It went as it had to," Frank had replied. "The truth came to light, and now we will have to live with those truths." Dale had nodded, understanding without needing more words. "Your father was a wise man, friend. He knew things the rest of us take a lifetime to learn." "Yes," Frank had agreed. He was. They had arrived at their house, the same house where they had lived 50 years, where they had raised their son, where they had survived the storm that had revealed so much. Frank had opened the door, and Mary had turned on the lights, and everything was exactly as they had left it that morning when they left for Street Lewis. But at the same time, everything was different, because now they knew truths they couldn't unknow. They had seen photographs they couldn't forget. They had heard words that would change forever how they viewed their life and their family. They had prepared for sleep in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. And when they finally lay in their old bed, in the complete darkness of the country where the stars shone with a clarity the city never knew, Mary had taken Frank's hand, just as she had done 50 years before when they got married. "We have each other," she had said. "We have each other," Frank had confirmed. And in that quiet night in Willow Creek, two elderly people who had been abandoned, betrayed, and finally vindicated, slept the sleep of those who have seen justice served, although it came mixed with the bitter taste of family loss. They slept knowing their future was secured not by the generosity of their son, but by the foresight of his father. And in that painful irony they found a kind of peace, because sometimes justice isn't sweet, sometimes it hurts as much as the injustice it corrects. But it remains necessary, remains true, and in the end remains the only thing that allows us to look at our reflection in the mirror without looking away. Meanwhile, on the highway back to Street Louis, there was no peace. The silence in Jacob's luxury SUV was deafening. The heated leather seats, the advanced climate control, the expensive sound system suddenly, it all felt like a cage. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel, soft, manicured hands that had never built anything, only signed papers to take things from others. For years, he had told himself he was the successful one, the one who escaped the dusty town. But as the city lights of Street Louis appeared on the horizon, they didn't look like a promise anymore. They looked cold. He realized he wasn't returning to a home. He was returning to a showroom, a life full of things, but empty of people who would stand by him in a storm. The $1.5 million was gone, yes, but the terrifying part was realizing that even if he had the money, he would still be the poorest man he knew. It is a harsh truth that often hits when the noise fades. You can have a wallet full of money and a life completely empty of love. Jacob has finally hit his emotional rock bottom, but the question remains, will this despair break him, or will it be the foundation for something new? Stay tuned to see if redemption is possible for a man who lost everything. The days that followed the reading of the will passed with a strange slowness, as if time itself had changed speed. Frank woke up every morning expecting to feel different, expecting the reality of suddenly being a man with resources to change something fundamental inside him. But when he opened his eyes and saw the same wooden beams of the ceiling, the same familiar cracks in the drywall, he realized he remained exactly the same man he had been all his life, only now that man carried truths that weighed more than any fortune. Mary had begun making lists, a habit she had developed over decades of managing a house with limited resources. But now her lists were different. They were no longer lists of what to buy with the last dollars left or what repair could be postponed another month. They were lists of small dreams she had kept for years, thinking they would never be fulfilled. Repairing the roof completely, so there were no more leaks. Replacing the old windows with ones that closed properly. Building an indoor bathroom instead of the one on the back porch. Buying a new stove that didn't spit smoke. "Look at this, old man," she had told him one morning, showing him her notebook where she had written everything with her trembling handwriting. "If we do these repairs, the house will be like new, better than new. It's going to last another 50 years. "We aren't going to live another 50 years, Frank had replied with a sad smile. "No, but the house will, and when we are no longer here, someone else is going to need it. Maybe Dale or his son or some young family from town. We can't take the money to the grave, old man, so we better use it to leave something good behind." It was so typical of Mary, Frank thought, to think of others even when they finally had the chance to think of themselves. They had spent their whole lives giving, sacrificing, putting others' needs before their own. And now, with the possibility of being selfish, of giving themselves the luxuries they never had, she still thought about how her good fortune could benefit the community. The news of the inheritance had spread through Willow Creek with the inevitable speed of gossip in small towns. Dale had maintained his silence about his participation in documenting Frank and Mary's life, but the fact they had gone to St. Louis and returned with news of a significant inheritance couldn't be kept secret. Neighbors had begun to visit them more frequently, some with genuine curiosity, others with less pure intentions, smelling opportunity where before they had only seen poverty. Mrs. Glenda had come one afternoon with sweet rolls and coffee, but also with an elaborate story about her son, who needed money for a business that was supposedly going to make the whole town rich. Mr. Bill, the handyman, had offered to do all the house repairs for a price Frank knew was triple fair. Even Father Michael from the local church had appeared, talking about the urgent needs to repair the bell tower and how a generous donation would be well seen by God and the community. "It's funny," Frank had said to Mary after the father left, "how people who never asked how we were when we were poor now have so many questions now that we have money." "Not everyone is like that," Mary had defended. "Dale and his family haven't changed at all with us. Mrs. Betty keeps bringing us pies on Saturdays, as she always has. There are good people still." "Yes," Frank had admitted, "but you also learn fast who likes you for who you are and who likes you for what you have." It was a lesson his son Jacob, evidently, had never learned, he thought bitterly. Or perhaps he had learned it backwards, believing people only had worth for what they could offer him, for how they could benefit him. Thus he had viewed his own parents all this time as resources to exploit or burdens to avoid, depending on how useful they were to his plans. 2 weeks had passed since the reading of the will when they received the first call from Jacob. Frank had been in the yard watering the tomato plants that had survived the storm when he heard the phone ring inside the house. Mary had answered, and Frank had heard the change in her voice, that particular tension that only appeared when she spoke with her son. He had entered the house, water from the hose still dripping from his hands, and Mary had extended the phone to him with an expression mixing hope and fear. Frank had taken the receiver with hands that trembled slightly. "Hello, Dad." Jacob's voice had sounded different, stripped of that professional confidence he normally wore like armor. It sounded tired, perhaps even defeated. "I need to talk to you and Mom." "We're here," Frank had said, without giving anything away, without making this easy for his son, because there was nothing easy in this situation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence full of words that can't be found or can't be said. Finally, Jacob had spoken again. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the law firm, about what Grandfather's will said, about the photographs of that afternoon of the storm." Frank had waited without interrupting, giving his son the space to continue. "I hired 3 different lawyers to review the will, to look for ways to challenge it. Everyone told me the same thing. It is solid, legal, unappealable. The conditional clauses are well grounded in legal precedents and the photographs. The photographs are irrefutable evidence that I did exactly what the will described as cause for disinheritance. And that's why you're calling? Frank had asked, feeling a pang of disappointment. Because your lawyers told you can't win? No. Jacob had replied quickly, and in his voice there was something sounding like urgency, like desperation to be understood. I'm calling because I've been looking at those photographs for 2 weeks. I obtained them legally through my own investigator, copies of the same ones presented at the law firm, and every time I look at them, I see what grandfather saw, what you saw, what any person with decency would see. And what is that? Frank had asked, his voice coming out harder than he intended. A son abandoning his parents in the middle of a storm, Jacob had said. And his voice had broken on the last word. I see 2 old people soaked, watching their son drive away, who chose his own comfort over their safety. And the worst, Dad, the absolute worst, is I remember perfectly that moment. I remember what I was thinking when I made that decision. Frank had closed his eyes, not sure if he wanted to hear this, not sure if he was ready to understand what had gone through his son's mind at that crucial moment. I thought you would be fine, Jacob had continued. I thought the house had withstood storms before and would withstand this one too. I thought I had an important hearing the next day and couldn't risk getting stranded in the town. I thought about Hunter and Savannah's schools, about Ashley's commitments, about my career, my life. I thought about everything except what should have been my first thought. You are my parents. You need me, and nothing I have or am would be possible without you. Tears had begun to roll down Frank's cheeks, silent and unexpected. Mary had moved closer, pressing her ear against the receiver to hear too. I have no excuse, Dad, Jacob had said, and now he was crying too, his weeping audible through the phone line. I can't say I was stressed or tired or didn't think straight. The truth is simpler and uglier than that. I had gotten used to putting my needs above yours. I had spent so much time distancing myself from my roots, being ashamed of where I come from, building this new person who was supposedly better, more successful, more important, that I forgot the basics. I forgot you gave me everything, and I owed you at least my presence, my time, my love. Jacob. Mary had started, but her son had continued as if he needed to say everything at once before losing the courage. Grandfather saw me better than I saw myself. He saw where I was heading before I got there and created that will not to punish me, although it feels like that, but to protect you from me, from what I had become. And he was right, Mom. He was absolutely right. Mary had let out a sob, her free hand squeezing Frank's arm so hard it hurt. I lost $1.5 million, Jacob had said, and during the first weeks after the reading of the will, that was the only thing I could think about everything I was going to do with that money, about how it was going to change our lives, about the opportunities my children would lose. I was furious with Grandfather, with the lawyer, even with you for accepting that money. But then I kept looking at those photographs and I realized something. What? Frank had asked, his voice barely a whisper. What I really lost wasn't the $5 million. What I lost was much earlier, much more gradually, and was much more valuable. I lost my parents. I lost you not when you died, but when I decided my new life was more important than the life you gave me. I lost you every time I cut short a phone call, every time I invented an excuse not to visit, every time I prioritized my career over your well-being. I lost you years before that storm. The storm only made visible a loss that had already occurred. It often takes hitting rock bottom for a person to realize they were climbing the wrong mountain all along. This is the moment of truth for Jacob. Can a bond this broken actually be repaired? Let's listen to find out if redemption is even possible. The silence that followed was of the kind existing between truths too big for words. Frank had looked at Mary, had seen his own pain reflected in her eyes, but had also seen something else. Hope. That dangerous hope parents always keep for their children, no matter how many times they have been hurt. What do you want from us, son? Frank had asked finally, because he needed to know if this was true repentance or just the pain of losing money disguised as emotional introspection. I don't want anything, Jacob had replied. I'm not asking you to share the inheritance. I'm not asking you to talk to the lawyer to reverse the decision. I'm not asking for anything material. The only thing I'm asking for is a chance. A chance? A chance to prove I can be the son I should have always been. A chance to know you again, for real, without hidden agendas or inheritance expectations. A chance for my children to know their grandparents like I knew you when I was a boy, before I became this thing I turned into. And Ashley? Mary had asked. Is she okay with this? There was a long pause, and when Jacob spoke again, his voice contained a new layer of pain. Ashley and I are having problems. When I told her about the will, about losing the inheritance, she reacted very badly, very badly. She told me things about you, about the town, about my past, that made me see who she really is. Or maybe I was always who wanted to see those things in her, because they confirmed what I had decided to believe, that my old life was something to be ashamed of, something to overcome. Son. Frank had started not knowing what to say, how to comfort a son who was finally seeing painful truths about all his relationships. I don't need comfort, Dad, Jacob had said. I need time. Time to prove this isn't just pretty words, said by a man who lost money and is looking for comfort. Time to rebuild what I destroyed, if you allow me. Frank and Mary had looked at each other, a complete conversation passing between them in that exchange of glances only 50 years of marriage can create. In Mary's eyes, he saw fear of being hurt again. But he also saw maternal love that had never really died, just been buried under layers of pain. In his own eyes, Frank knew she saw the same. Can you come visit us? Frank had said finally, choosing every word carefully. You can bring the kids. But Jacob, you need to understand something. We aren't going to pretend everything is fine. We aren't going to act as if the last years haven't happened. If you come, you're going to see our real life, not an edited version that's more comfortable for you. You're going to see how we live, what our days have been like without you, what your absence really meant. That's what I want, Jacob had replied. I want to see the truth, the whole truth. I've had enough of comfortable lies. Then, come next Sunday, Mary had said, her voice firm despite the tears. But come early, not like a visitor who appears for an hour and leaves. Come in the morning and stay all day. Eat with us. Work with us in the yard. Talk with us for real, and bring Hunter and Savannah, but let them put away their phones. I want to know my grandchildren for real, not the versions of them existing behind screens. Okay, Jacob had agreed. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity I don't deserve. It's not about deserving, son, Frank had said. It's about family, and despite everything, despite the pain and disappointment and betrayal, you are still our son. That doesn't change just because you lost an inheritance. But if you're going to be part of our lives again, it has to be real, without pretenses, without shame of where we come from. Can you do that? I'm going to try, Jacob had promised. With everything I have, I'm going to try. When they hung up the phone, Frank and Mary had hugged in the middle of their small living room, surrounded by the remains of a life lived with dignity despite poverty, crying for everything lost and everything perhaps could be recovered. There were no guarantees. Both knew it. Jacob might be being sincere in this moment of pain and loss, but sincerity in a moment of crisis doesn't always translate into permanent change. People return to their habitual patterns once the initial shock passes. But for now there was hope, and sometimes hope is enough to continue. The days before Sunday had felt endless. Mary had cleaned the house with an intensity Frank hadn't seen in years, as if sweeping and mopping could prepare not just the physical space, but also the emotional one for what was coming. She had made chicken and dumplings, Jacob's favorite dish when he was a boy, and had prepared fresh, sweet tea. She had taken out the few photographs they had of when Jacob was small, placed them on the living room table, small visual reminders of who he had been before becoming who he was now. Frank had worked in the yard repairing small things he had let go for years, not because he wanted to impress his son, but because doing something with his hands helped him calm the anxiety he felt. Dale had come to help him, working silently beside him, understanding without need of words that Frank needed company more than conversation. Do you think he has changed? Frank had asked him finally while fixing a section of the fence that had fallen during the storm. Dale had considered the question carefully before answering. I don't know, friend. Men can change. I've seen it happen. But usually they need to hit rock bottom before that change is real. Maybe losing $1.5 million was his rock bottom. Or maybe he needs to fall more still. Time will tell. I don't know if I can stand another disappointment, Frank had admitted. I'm not young anymore. My heart isn't as strong as it was. Then protect it, Dale had advised. Give your son a chance, but don't give him all your heart at once. Make him earn it step by step, action by action. Words are easy, friend. Deeds are what count. It was good advice, and Frank had kept it in his mind while they continued working under the hot September sun. Sunday had arrived finally, dawning clear and cool, one of those perfect days that sometimes appear without apparent reason. Frank and Mary had gotten up even earlier than usual, nervous as teenagers before a first date. They had checked everything multiple times, the food prepared, the house clean, the yard fixed, and then they had waited. Jacob had said he would arrive at 8 inches the morning. At 8:05, Frank had begun to feel that familiar pang of disappointment, that fear that his son had changed his mind, that the pretty words on the phone were just that, words without substance. But at 8:10, they had heard the engine of the black SUV, and minutes later, Jacob had parked in front of their house. This time he had come alone with his children, without Ashley, without Thor. Hunter and Savannah had stepped out of the truck with expressions mixing curiosity and resistance, clearly wondering why their father had dragged them to this dusty town so early on a Sunday, when they could be sleeping or playing with their electronic devices. But the most notable was Jacob himself. He wasn't wearing his expensive clothes, his Italian loafers, his appearance of a successful lawyer. Instead, he wore old jeans and a simple t-shirt. And when he approached his parents, there was something different in his posture, in how he walked. It wasn't that confident and almost arrogant walk he had carried for years anymore. It was humbler, more uncertain, more human. "Dad, Mom," he had said, and then he had done something he hadn't done in decades. He had knelt in front of them, there on the dirt road, in front of his house, in front of neighbors who had come out to their porches to observe. "I came to ask for your forgiveness. Not with words only, but with actions. I came to learn again how to be your son." Hunter and Savannah had watched their father with eyes wide with shock. Clearly, they had never seen their father in a position of such vulnerability, of such humility. Frank had looked at that man kneeling in front of him, that man who was his son, but who had been a stranger for so long, and had seen something in his eyes that gave him hope, genuine shame, but also determination. Not the superficial determination of someone trying to manipulate a situation, but the deep determination of someone who finally understands what he has lost and is willing to do the hard work of trying to recover it. "Get up, son," Frank had said, extending his hand. "We don't need to see you on your knees. We just need to see you here, present, real. It takes a lot of courage to kneel in the dust, but sometimes humility is the only way to truly stand tall again." As we near the end of our journey with the Robles family, ask yourself, would you have been able to forgive as Frank did? Jacob had stood up, taken his father's hand, and for the first time in years they had hugged for real. Not one of those quick and obligatory hugs Jacob had given during his sporadic visits, but a true hug, long, the kind that transmit everything words cannot. And then Mary had wrapped both in her arms, and the three had stood there, on the dusty street of Willow Creek, crying and hugging while the neighbors watched. And Hunter and Savannah watched with confusion, but also with something that could have been the beginning of understanding. "Come," Mary had said finally, wiping tears with the apron she wore. "Let's go inside. I have dumplings, and you have to eat them while they're hot." They had entered the house, and for the first time Jacob had really seen it. Not with the distant and critical look of someone cataloging deficiencies, but with eyes trying to remember, seeking to reconnect with buried memories. He had touched the drywall as if he had never felt it before. He had looked at the photographs on the table. He had sat in the chair where he used to sit as a child. "Everything is smaller than I remembered," he had said softly. "But also more real, more honest. No pretenses here, right? Just life lived with what you have. It's all we ever knew how to be," Frank had replied. Hunter and Savannah had sat uncomfortably on the sofa, without their phones, which Jacob had made them leave in the truck, just as Mary had asked. Without their screens to protect them, they looked younger, more vulnerable, more like the children they really were underneath all the technology and privilege. "Hunter, Savannah," Mary had said, approaching them, "I know you don't know me well. I'm practically a stranger to you, even though I'm your grandmother. But I would like us to spend this day together getting to know each other. Sound good?" The twins had looked at each other, that silent language twins share. And then Savannah had nodded shyly. "Okay, she had said. "But what are we going to do? There's nothing here." Mary had smiled, a smile that understood the innocence behind those words. The way children raised with everything never learn to find entertainment in simple things. "There's more than you think," she had said. "There are stories. There is work to do. There is food to prepare. There is a whole town to explore. There is life, my girl. Real life. Not life through a screen. And today you are going to learn what it was like when your father was a boy before he had everything you have now." And so a day had begun that none of them would forget. They had eaten chicken and dumplings together at the small kitchen table. Everyone squeezed, elbows bumping, laughing when sauce spilled, sharing napkins because there weren't enough. Jacob had eaten with an appetite he hadn't shown in years, savoring every bite as if it were the first time he tasted his mother's food, or perhaps as if it were the last. After breakfast, Frank had taken Jacob and the twins to the backyard, where there was still much work to do to repair the storm damage. Hunter had protested initially, saying he didn't know how to do manual labor, that he could get hurt. But Jacob, instead of giving in as he probably would have done before, had put tools in his hands and told him it was time to learn. And so, under the rising September sun, 3 generations of Robles men had worked together. Frank teaching, Jacob relearning, Hunter discovering for the first time the simple satisfaction of building something with one's own hands. Jacob struggled with a stubborn fence post, his soft hands slipping, frustration rising in his chest, just like it used to when he was a teenager. He cursed under his breath, ready to kick the wood, ready to quit. It was his old instinct. If it's hard, buy a solution or walk away. But Frank didn't scold him. He didn't mock the successful lawyer who couldn't fix a simple fence. Instead, he walked over and placed his weathered hand over Jacob's shaking one. "Easy, son," Frank whispered, his voice steady as an old oak. "You're trying to force it. Wood has a grain. Life has a rhythm. You have to work with it, not against it." Jacob froze. He looked at his father's hand covering his own. The contrast between the scarred, capable hand of the farmer and the smooth, manicured hand of the lawyer brought tears to his eyes. He took a deep breath, nodded, and for the first time in 20 years, he let his father guide him. They had repaired the fence, rebuilt the chicken coop, cleaned the area where the apple tree had lost its branches. Hunter had hit his thumb with the hammer at one point and had started crying, not just from the pain, but from the frustration of not being able to do something that seemed so easy when his grandfather did it. Frank had approached, examined the bruised thumb, and then done something Hunter would never forget. He had taken the boy's hand between his own, tanned and calloused, and kissed it gently. "That's how you learn, son," he had said. "With mistakes, with pain, by trying again. Hands that never get hurt are hands that never build anything." And Hunter, 12 years old, accustomed to a life where everything came easy, where every whim was satisfied, where he had never had to really strive for anything, had felt something change inside him. It wasn't something he could name or explain, but it was real. It was the beginning of understanding that there was value in effort, dignity in work, pride in creating something with one's own hands. Meanwhile, inside the house, Mary had been teaching Savannah to make homemade biscuits. The girl had been skeptical at first, her hands soft and inexperienced, clumsy with the dough. But Mary had been patient, guiding her hands, showing her how to feel the right consistency, how to knead lightly so they wouldn't be tough. "Your dad used to do this when he was little," Mary had said while they worked. "He sat on that same stool where you are and helped me cut the biscuits for dinner. He loved doing it. He said it was like art, creating something perfect and round from something shapeless." "Really?" Savannah had asked, trying to imagine her father always so serious and professional as a boy making biscuits. "I can't imagine him." "It's because you don't really know him," Mary had said gently. "You know the man he became, but not the boy he was. And I think your dad is trying to remember that boy too, to find him again underneath all the layers he built." Savannah had considered this while shaping another biscuit, this time more softly, with more care. "Why did he stop coming here? Why did he almost never bring us to visit you?" It was a difficult question, one Mary had avoided answering directly for years when the twins occasionally asked about their grandparents. But now, on this day of truths, she decided to be honest. "Because your dad became ashamed of where he came from," she had said simply. "When he went to study in the city, he discovered a bigger world, with more opportunities, with more money. And instead of being grateful for the roots that allowed him to get there, he decided those roots were something that made him less, that defined him in ways he didn't want. So he moved away from them. He moved away from us. But that is. Savannah had struggled to find the word. Bad? Mean? Yes, Mary had agreed. It is both things. But my girl, your dad isn't bad. He just got lost for a while and now is trying to find the way back. And part of that path is bringing you here so you know where you come from. So you understand that money and nice things are pleasant. But they aren't what defines you as people. Savannah had nodded slowly and continued making biscuits with her small hands, learning a skill her grandmother mastered, connecting through simple work with generations of women who had done exactly this in this same kitchen. Later, while dusting the living room shelves, Savannah found an old, tattered sketchbook tucked behind the family Bible. She opened it carefully. Inside weren't legal notes or calculations, but drawings, charcoal sketches of the old apple tree, of a sleeping dog, of Frank working in the fields. They were beautiful, full of emotion and talent. Your father drew those when he was your age, Mary said softly, standing behind her. Savannah ran her finger over the signature at the bottom. Jacob, age 12. She looked up at her grandmother, eyes wide. I didn't know Dad could draw. He never draws. He only signs contracts. He used to dream of being an artist. Mary smiled sadly. Before he decided that money was the only way to be happy. Maybe, if you ask him, he remembers how to hold a pencil for something other than work. Savannah hugged the book to her chest, realizing for the first time that her father wasn't just a suit. He was a person who had lost his way. At lunchtime, everyone had gathered around the table. The biscuits Savannah had made, imperfect but made with genuine effort, had been served with pride. The pot roast Mary had cooked, the green beans, the mashed potatoes, everything had been put on the table and shared. And while they ate, Jacob had begun to talk, not in a formal or prepared way, but naturally, letting the words flow. When I received the letter from the lawyer 6 months ago telling me there was a will from grandfather, the first thing I felt was excitement, he had admitted. I thought of all the money there probably was, about how I would use it. I paid 3 lawyers to advise me on inheritance taxes, on how to maximize the value. I even started making plans to expand my firm, to buy a bigger house. Frank and Mary had listened in silence, without judging, just present. And yes, I started visiting you more, but not because I missed you or because I cared how you were. It was strategic. I thought if the will had clauses about family treatment, I needed to make sure my record looked good. It was calculated, cold, exactly what grandfather feared I had become. Hunter and Savannah watched their father with expressions of shock. Never had they heard him speak like this, with such brutal honesty about his own failures. And then came that afternoon of the storm. Jacob had continued, his voice breaking slightly. I was tired from the trip, annoyed because Ashley had complained the whole way, frustrated because you didn't have Wi-Fi and the kids were restless. When the storm started and Ashley said we should leave, the only thing I felt was relief, an excuse to leave, to cut the visit short, to return to my comfortable life. He had paused, looking at his hands on the table, hands that had never known real work until today. I didn't think about you, he had admitted, not about your safety, not about your fear, not about how you would feel being abandoned. I only thought about myself. And when I saw those photographs at the law firm, when I saw your faces watching my SUV drive away, I finally understood what I had done. Not just that afternoon, but for years. I had abandoned you long before that storm. The storm only made it visible. The silence at the table was deep. Hunter had tears in his eyes, trying to understand how his father, his hero, could have done something like that. And the dog? Savannah had asked suddenly, her voice small. Why did we take Thor but leave them? It was a simple child's question, but it cut straight to the heart of the cruelty of what had happened. Jacob had looked at his daughter, had seen the confusion and disappointment in her eyes, and had understood this was a defining moment, not just for his relationship with his parents, but also with his own children. Because Thor was a possession, he had explained, something I felt was mine, that I had bought, that had value to me. And at that moment, ashamed as I am to admit it, I valued my possessions more than the people who gave me life. That is wrong, Dad, Hunter had said with the simple moral certainty of a 1-2-year-old boy. really wrong. Yes, son, Jacob had agreed. It is. And that is why we are here. Not only to apologize to your grandparents, although that is important, but for you to learn from my mistakes, to see where you come from, to know the value of hard work and sacrifice, so you never repeat what I did. The rest of the day had passed with an almost magical quality, as if time had slowed down to allow them to savor every moment. They had walked through the town, Frank and Mary showing the twins the places where Jacob had played as a boy, the houses of his childhood friends, the store where he bought candy with the dollars he earned helping his father in the fields. They had visited the church where Father Michael had been surprised but pleased to see Jacob after so many years. They had passed by the elementary school where Jacob had studied, now closed for being Sunday, but visible through the chain-link fence, its modest classrooms, a stark contrast to the expensive private school where Hunter and Savannah studied. And in every place, Jacob had shared memories. But not the edited and nostalgic memories people normally share. He had shared truths. How he had started to be ashamed of this school when he saw schools in the city, how he had stopped mentioning the town when he met Ashley's parents, how he had gradually built a false narrative about his childhood that minimized poverty, but also erased the real wealth he had had in love and community. It is a profound moment when a father stops trying to impress his children with his success and starts impressing them with his honesty. Jacob is finally realizing that he traded the gold of his family's love for the fool's gold of social status. A hard lesson, but one that might just save his children's future. Don't go anywhere, because as the sun sets on this day of healing, the Robles family is about to make a decision that will change their lives forever. At sunset, they had sat everyone on the porch of the house, watching the sun set over the fields surrounding Willow Creek, painting the sky with oranges and pinks and purples. Hunter and Savannah were tired from the day of work and walking, a physical tiredness they had never experienced in their lives of privilege. But it was a satisfying tiredness, the kind that comes from having done something real. "Grandpa," Hunter had said suddenly, using the term naturally for the first time, "can we come back next week? I want to finish the chicken coop, and I want to learn how to make more things." Frank had felt his heart expand in his chest, tears burning his eyes. He looked at Jacob and saw in his son's eyes something he hadn't seen in decades. Genuine pride, not in his professional achievements or his status, but in his children beginning to learn real values. "You can come whenever you want, son," Frank had replied. "This is your house too. It always has been." "And can I learn to make more biscuits?" Savannah had asked, looking at Mary. "The ones I made today didn't turn out very well, but I want to keep practicing." "Of course, my girl," Mary had said, hugging her. "You're going to be an expert. You just need practice and patience." When finally it was time for Jacob and the twins to leave, the goodbyes were different from any they had had in years. They weren't fast or obligatory. They were long, genuine, full of promises to return soon. Jacob had hugged his father for a long time, and in that hug something had happened that words cannot capture completely. Forgiveness, not verbalized, but real. Acceptance of past mistakes, and commitment to do better in the future. The understanding that the road back would be long and difficult, but that it was worth walking. "Thank you," Jacob had whispered against his father's shoulder. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "We will never give up on you, son," Frank had replied. "That's not what parents do. We only hope you find the way back to who you really are." When the black SUV finally drove away, this time with everyone turning to wave goodbye through the windows, Frank and Mary had stayed on the porch until the taillights disappeared in the distance. But this time it didn't feel like an abandonment. It felt like a beginning. The months that followed that transformative Sunday brought changes Frank and Mary had never imagined possible. Jacob kept his word in a way that surpassed even their most cautious hopes. Every weekend without fail, the black SUV appeared on the dusty streets of Willow Creek, and from it stepped Jacob and the twins, sometimes early Saturday morning to take advantage of 2 full days. The visits had become a routine, but not the empty routine of obligation they had been before. They were routines full of real life, of shared work, of conversations that went beyond superficialities. Hunter had become Frank's dedicated apprentice, following him through the fields, learning about crops and seasons, about how to read the weather in the clouds, about the patience required to make something grow from seed to harvest. His hands, before soft and inexperienced, had developed small calluses, of which he spoke with pride, showing them to his grandfather like medals of honor. Savannah had found in Mary not just a grandmother, but a teacher of wisdom no expensive school could teach her. She learned not only to make perfect biscuits, but also to cook traditional stews, to embroider, to recognize medicinal plants in the field, to listen to the stories of the town's elders that contained lessons on life and dignity. The girl who had arrived that first Sunday with resistance in her eyes now arrived with notebooks where she wrote recipes and home remedies, determined to preserve that knowledge she felt was in danger of being lost. But the most notable change was in Jacob himself. He had begun to arrive dressed not in his lawyer clothes, but in work clothes, worn jeans and simple shirts. He had stopped checking his phone constantly, talking about legal cases and important hearings. Instead, he had allowed himself simply to be a son again. Not the successful son he had tried to be, but the present son his parents had always needed. One October afternoon, while they repaired a section of the roof that had suffered minor damage during a recent rain, Jacob had spoken about Ashley. It was the first time he mentioned his marital situation since that initial phone call. "We're getting divorced," he had said without preamble, hammering a nail with more force than necessary. "The papers are already in process." Frank had stopped working, looking at his son with a mix of concern and understanding. "Are you okay with that?" "Yes," Jacob had replied honestly. "It hurts to admit a marriage of 15 years is ending. It hurts to know my children are going to grow up in 2 houses instead of 1. But it's also a relief, Dad. Ashley and I built our relationship on values I now realize were wrong. Status, money, appearances. When I lost grandfather's inheritance, when all that facade crumbled, there was nothing real underneath to hold us together." "And the kids?" Frank had asked, thinking of Hunter and Savannah, whom he now knew for real, whom he loved with the intensity only grandparents can feel. "They are processing it," Jacob had said, "but honestly I think in a way it's a relief for them. They've also seen fewer fights since Ashley and I decided to separate than the ones they saw when we tried to maintain the appearance of a happy marriage. And they've had this." He had made a broad gesture encompassing the house, the town, the life they had rediscovered as an anchor. "You have given them something stable, while everything else in their lives changed." They had worked in silence for a while, the sound of hammers creating a shared rhythm. Then Jacob had spoken again, his voice softer. "You know what's most ironic about all this? I spent years chasing money, status, material success. I sold land that was my heritage. I moved away from you. I built a complete life based on accumulating things. And in the end, when I really had the chance to obtain a fortune, $1.5 million, I lost it because I couldn't do the simplest thing: be a good son. Grandfather was offering me $750,000 basically for doing what I should have been doing anyway, without any promise of money. And I couldn't." "Your grandfather wasn't offering you money for being a good son," Frank had corrected gently. "He was giving you the chance to be a good son without the corruption of money. The inheritance was just the test, not the purpose." "I know now," Jacob had said, "but it took losing everything to understand it. I had to hit rock bottom, as they say. Lose the inheritance, face divorce, see the disappointment in my own children's eyes when I told them what I had done. I had to lose everything I thought defined me to find what really matters." Frank had put his hand on his son's shoulder, a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. "Sometimes we need to lose to find. Your grandfather knew it. That's why he created that test, not to punish you, but to save you from yourself." "Do you think he's proud of me now?" Jacob had asked, and in his voice there was a vulnerability Frank hadn't heard since he was a boy. "Wherever he is, do you think he sees what I'm trying to do?" "I believe so," Frank had replied. "And I think he's prouder now than if you had simply inherited the money, because now you are choosing to be better, not because there is a reward waiting for you, but because you understand why it's the right thing." The weeks had turned into months, and with every visit, with every conversation, the wound between father and son had begun to heal. It wasn't a quick or easy cure. There were moments of tension, painful memories that surfaced unexpectedly, old patterns that threatened to reassert themselves. But there was commitment from both sides to keep trying, not to give up. Dale had observed all this transformation with quiet satisfaction. One afternoon, while he and Frank drank coffee on the porch, he had reflected on the role he had played in all this. "You know," Friend, during 5 years I documented your life, your son's scarce visits, the brief calls, everything. And I didn't feel good doing it, even knowing it was for a good reason. It felt like betraying the trust of the neighborhood. But you did it anyway, Frank had said. Why? Because Arthur convinced me it was necessary, Dale had explained. He told me sometimes the greatest love requires actions that feel like betrayal in the short term, but are protection in the long term. He told me, if Jacob really was the man he feared he had become, you would need protection. And if he wasn't, then the documented truth would prove it, and there would be no harm. And it turned out, my father was right, Frank had said with sadness. Jacob was exactly what he feared. He was, Dale had emphasized, but he isn't anymore. Or at least he's trying not to be. And that counts for something, doesn't it? The fact that a man can see his mistakes and work to correct them, even when he already lost what he thought he wanted. Frank had nodded, thinking of the 10% of the inheritance Dale had received, according to the terms of the will. Money his neighbor had used wisely to improve his own house, send his son Tyler to a better trade school, and establish a small emergency fund for the town. That money you received, Frank had said, wasn't just payment for a service. It was my father recognizing that the true wealth of a town isn't in bank accounts, but in the good people who take care of each other. Winter arrived with its cold nights and short days, and with it also arrived the anniversary of Arthur's death. 6 years had passed since the old man had closed his eyes for the last time, taking with him his secrets and his wisdom. Frank, Mary, Jacob, and the twins had gone together to the town cemetery, a quiet place on a hill where the dead rested under old trees and rusty iron crosses. Arthur's grave was simple, as the man had been in life, a gray granite headstone with his name, the dates of his birth and death, and a phrase he himself had chosen years before dying: I sowed values and reaped love. Jacob had knelt in front of his grandfather's grave, wiped the dry leaves that had accumulated on the headstone, and spoken as if the old man could hear him. I know I was late understanding what you were trying to teach me. I spent years being exactly the kind of man you feared I would become. I put money above family, ambition above love, status above values. And when you put me to the test, I failed in the most spectacular way possible. Hunter and Savannah listened in silence, standing next to their grandparents Frank and Mary, learning about emotional honesty, about admitting mistakes, about the courage required to face painful truths. But I also know, Jacob had continued, his voice breaking, that your will wasn't just about punishing my mistakes. It was about forcing me to see them. It was about protecting my parents from my negligence, and it was about giving me one last chance to find the way back to who I should have been always. He had taken something out of his pocket, an old and faded photograph Frank recognized immediately. It was from when Jacob was maybe 7 years old, sitting on Arthur's lap, both smiling at the camera, the boy with 2 missing teeth and the old man with deep wrinkles around his eyes. It was a captured moment of pure love, before the world and its ambitions complicated everything. I've carried this photo in my wallet since the reading of the will, Jacob had explained. It reminds me who I was and who I can still be. It reminds me that that boy in the photo had everything that really mattered, and that the man he became almost lost everything, chasing things that didn't matter. He had placed the photograph on the grave, holding it there with a small stone, and then touched the headstone with his forehead, a gesture of respect, of repentance, of gratitude. Thank you, grandfather, he had whispered. Thank you for loving me enough not to let me continue on the wrong path. Thank you for protecting my parents when I didn't. And thank you for believing there was still hope for me, even when I had stopped believing in myself. They had spent almost an hour in the cemetery, each with their own thoughts, their own silent conversations with the man who had orchestrated all this transformation from beyond the grave. And when they finally went down the hill back to the town, they felt lighter somehow, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. That night, gathered everyone in Frank and Mary's house for a simple dinner of vegetable soup and fresh bread, Jacob had made an announcement. I've made a decision, he said, looking at his parents. I'm going to close my firm in Street Louis. Well, not close it completely, but reduce it significantly. I'm going to hire another lawyer to handle most cases and only keep a few select clients. And I'm going to move closer to here. Mary had dropped her spoon with a metallic clatter against the plate. What? Not to the town itself, Jacob had clarified quickly. I know my life, the kids' education, Everything is in the city, but there are bigger towns just 30 minutes from here, places where I can live and work, but be close enough to visit you not just on weekends, but any day, to be here. If you need me, when you need me, and your career? Frank had asked, worried, despite his joy. You've worked years to build that firm. And almost destroyed my soul in the process, Jacob had replied. Dad, I've had a lot of time to think in these last months about what success really means, about what is worth sacrificing and what isn't. And I realized all the money, all the cases won, all the professional reputation means nothing if I win it at the cost of the only relationships that really matter. But money is important, son, Frank had said. You have to support your children, pay the bills, and I will, Jacob had assured. I'm not going to be poor. I'll still earn well, just less, and I'll work fewer hours. I'll have less stress, and I'll have more time for what really matters. For you, for Hunter and Savannah, for myself, to remember who I am underneath all the expensive suits and professional titles. Hunter had looked at his father with admiration. Dad, that's great. I'll be able to come see Grandpa after school some days. Exactly, Jacob had said, ruffling his son's hair. And you're going to keep learning the things he can teach you, things no expensive school can give. Savannah had been unusually quiet, processing all this information. Finally she had spoken, her voice small but clear. Is this because of the money you lost? Because of my great-grandfather's inheritance? It was a direct question of the kind only children can ask, cutting through adult subtleties to the heart of the matter. Jacob had looked at his daughter, understanding this was an important teaching moment. Not exactly, my love. It's not because I lost the money, but because losing that money forced me to see what I had already lost. I lost years with your grandparents. I almost lost the relationship with you because I was so busy working I barely saw you. I was losing my soul little by little, becoming someone I didn't like when I looked in the mirror. And do you like yourself now? Savannah had asked. Now I like myself more, Jacob had replied honestly. I'm not perfect. I still have a lot of work to do on myself, but at least now I'm working on the right things, not just on making more money or impressing people. The winter months passed with their own rhythms and challenges. Jacob kept his word, reduced his firm, hired help, and began the process of moving to a bigger but still rural town near Willow Creek. The twins adjusted to dividing their time between their father's house and their mother's. And although it wasn't easy, Jacob made sure the weekends they were with him were always special, always meaningful, always including time with Frank and Mary. The inheritance Frank and Mary had received was used exactly as they had promised, for necessary repairs on their house, to ensure their medical well-being in old age, and to help discreetly others in the town who were in need. They didn't become ostentatious with their money. In fact, most people in the town never knew exactly how much they had inherited. They only knew that suddenly, when someone in the town had a medical emergency, they couldn't pay, or when a family was about to lose their house due to debts, or when a child needed help to continue their studies, mysteriously the necessary support appeared. This is how your father-in-law would have wanted it used. Mary had told Frank one night, while reviewing the accounts and deciding whom to help that month, not to accumulate more or to impress anyone, but to make the difference he can no longer make. The charity fund that had been established according to the terms of the will also began its work identifying abandoned elderly people throughout Missouri, providing them with financial support, ensuring they had food, medicine, a dignified place to live. Attorney Eugene administered the fund diligently, sending regular reports to Frank about the lives being touched by Arthur's foresight. Your father is helping people he never met, Frank had told Jacob one afternoon while reading one of those reports together. There is a woman in Branson, 83 years old, abandoned by her children, who now has a small apartment paid for by the fund. There is a man in Street Louis receiving medicine for his diabetes. There is a couple in Lake of the Ozarks who can eat with dignity every day. Your grandfather is doing good, even after death. Jacob had read the report with tears in his eyes, understanding this was Arthur's true inheritance, not just the money, but the legacy of values, of caring for the vulnerable, of remembering real wealth is measured in lives touched, not in bank accounts. Spring arrived with its explosion of life, and with it also arrived the first anniversary of the reading of the will. A full year had passed since that painful but necessary day at the law firm, when all truths had been exposed, when Jacob had faced the consequences of his actions, when the long road back had begun. To commemorate the occasion, Frank and Mary organized a gathering at their house, not just with Jacob and the twins, but also with Dale and his family, with some close neighbors who had been part of their lives for decades, with attorney Eugene, who had made the trip from Street Louis to be present. The house was full of life, of laughter, of shared food. The yard they had repaired together now bloomed with new plants Hunter had helped plant. The kitchen where Savannah had learned to make biscuits smelled of stew and pie. The walls that had seen so much pain now resonated with happy and genuine conversation. In a moment of the afternoon, Frank had asked for silence. He had raised his glass of sweet tea because they didn't drink alcohol, never had, and had made a toast. "It's been a year." His voice began trembling slightly with emotion. "We were in a law firm in Street Louis discovering truths that hurt like knives. My father, Arthur, had left us not just an inheritance of money, but an inheritance of wisdom. He taught us that true love sometimes requires tough tests, that truth is more valuable than comfort, and that it is never too late to change the path we are on." Everyone had listened in respectful silence, even the twins who were normally restless. "This year has been difficult," Frank had continued. "We have had to face mistakes, forgive betrayals, rebuild trust that had been broken. It is rare to witness a family come back from such a deep betrayal, but the Robles family proves that wounds can heal if you stop ignoring them and start treating them." Frank's words remind us that forgiveness isn't a weakness, but the hardest work a person can do. As we approach the final moments of our story, listen closely, because the greatest reward they found wasn't the money. It was something far more lasting. But it has also been the best year of our lives in a long time, because we got our son back, we really got to know our grandchildren, and we understood that true wealth was never the money my father left us, but the family he helped us save. Jacob had been crying openly, without being ashamed of his tears, without trying to hide them behind the professional mask he used to wear. "My grandfather gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me," he had said when it was his turn to speak. "Not money, although that was what I initially thought when I learned of the will. He gave me one last chance to see who I had become and choose to be different. He gave me the necessary pain to wake up from a life I was living on autopilot, and he gave me back my parents, whom I should never have lost in the first place." He had raised his glass, looking directly at Frank and Mary. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for giving me another chance when I had already lost the right to ask for it. And thank you for showing me every day what unconditional love really means. Not love that ignores mistakes, but love that confronts them, that demands better, that never stops believing we can be better than we are." The glasses had clinked, voices had joined in a collective cheer, and the celebration had continued until the sun set and the stars came out shining over Willow Creek with that clarity that only exists far from city lights. Later that night, when all the guests had left, and only Frank, Mary, Jacob, and the twins remained, they had sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cool spring night air. "Grandpa," Hunter had said, curled up against Frank, "can I ask you something?" "Always, my son." "Do you think great-grandfather knew everything was going to turn out like this? That Dad was going to change and we were going to be all together again?" Frank had considered the question carefully. "I don't think he knew for certain. I think he had hope, but he also had fear of being wrong. That's why he created the will as he did, with two possible scenarios. He gave your dad every chance to prove he was better than he feared. And when your dad failed the test, the will protected your grandmother and me, but also gave your dad the jolt he needed to wake up. It was wise," Savannah had observed. "It was love," Mary had corrected. "Tough love, love that hurts sometimes, but real love. Your great-grandfather loved this family so much he was willing to seem cruel, to create painful tests, because he understood sometimes true love means not making things easy, but doing the right thing." Jacob had been looking at the stars, listening to his parents teach his children lessons he himself was barely learning again. And in that moment, he had felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. The peace that comes not from having everything you want, but from wanting what you have. The peace that comes from being where you belong, with the people who love you for who you are, not for what you have achieved or how much money you have. "Dad," Savannah had said, her voice sleepy as she fought against sleep. "Yes, my love. Can we stay here tonight at Grandma and Grandpa's house? I don't want this day to end yet. Jacob had looked at his parents, asking silently. Frank and Mary had nodded with smiles that said more than 1,000 words. Yes, Jacob had said. We're staying. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. And so, for the first time in countless years, 3 generations of the Robles family had slept under the same roof in that humble farmhouse in Willow Creek. Hunter and Savannah in the room that had been their father's as a boy. Jacob on a mattress in the living room. Frank and Mary in their bed, where they had slept for 50 years. United not by obligation or the promise of inheritance, but by something much stronger and lasting. Rebuilt love, trust, earned again, and the shared understanding that family, when truly present, is the only wealth that really matters. In the darkness of the night, Frank had taken Mary's hand as he did every night, and she had squeezed back as she always did. They didn't need words. Both knew Arthur would be proud of what they had achieved, of how his son had finally found the way back, of how his great-grandchildren were learning values no expensive school could teach. In the quiet darkness of the night, Frank held Mary's hand, their sleep now more peaceful than ever before. Justice had been served, not through vengeance, but through the foresight of a father who saw the future clearly. Jacob had lost $1.5 million, but he was allowed to keep the chance to rebuild his life. That is the greatest mercy parents can grant their children. Thank you for joining the Robles family through this storm. Please type the word dignity in the comments if you agree that a person's character is worth more than all the treasures in the world.